Zorian could tell right away that the Hydra in front of them was not normal. First of all, it was too big. He was no expert on Hydras, but he knew that even the largest ones didn't grow more than 10 meters in length. This one seemed to be at least twice that size, if the size of its heads was of any indication. Then there was the matter of how suddenly it had appeared on his senses. There was no way he could miss something like that with even casual inspection, never mind the detailed sweep he had done on the cenote. The mind he was currently sensing was one of the most distinctive things he had ever witnessed through his mind sense, and it should have drawn his attention immediately. The Hydra seemed to have 9 minds, one for each head, and a 9th one that served as a kind of overmind, for the lack of a better term. The individual heads seemed to be somehow suborned to the main mind of the Hydra, which was probably in charge of coordinating the heads towards an overarching goal. It was kind of fascinating. Then the Hydra pointed all 8 of its heads at them and roared. If they were dealing with a normal Hydra, this would just be a cheap intimidation tactic. Instead, the roar was infused with potent wind magic, battering the whole group with a powerful gust of wind. Zack and Zorian simply glued their feet to the ground with non-structured magic, and Daiman protected most of his team with an impressively quick force wall spell. Sadly, that still left 4 people at the mercy of the incoming wind attack. Of those 4, one was Hasana, who simply stabbed his staff into the ground and held on to it with pure physical strength. Zorian was impressed. The old man looked kind of gaunt, but there seemed to be surprising strength hidden under his wiry frame. As for the other 3, they were not as quick on their feet and merely released a chorus of short cries and screams as they were blown off their feet and sent tumbling into the distance. They didn't die, but they wouldn't be getting up any time soon. Zack was the one who handled the surprise attack the best. While everyone else, even Zorian, was scrambling to withstand the roar somehow, Zack was already casting some kind of complex spell in retaliation. He transformed the entire area in front of him into a field of roughly hewn stone blades before the windstorm even had time to die down, all of them wreathed in ominous red light. Then he slammed both of his hands into the earth before him, sending them all hurtling towards the Hydra. The monster took one look at the approaching cloud of stony death, its many eyes widening in surprise and fear, then immediately cut its roar short and withdrew all of its heads back into the cenote. The chameleon drakes, still arranged around the cenote, were not as quick. The rain of blades slammed into the area around the cenote, burying themselves deep into the jungle soil and impaling through any chameleon drakes that were unfortunate enough to be in the way. The lucky ones were slain on the spot by the stone shards. The less fortunate ones wailed like wounded pigs as the red light that infused the blades spread throughout their bodies and started liquefying their insides. The surviving chameleon drakes lost any semblance of group cohesion and simply scattered in all directions, abandoning their former home, the pained cries of their dying brethren motivating them to keep going until they had left the range of Zorian's mind sense entirely. Zack wasn't really paying attention to the chameleon drakes, though. They were just collateral damage. The moment he had launched the rain of flesh-dissolving blades at the Hydra, before he had even known whether it would hit its target or not, he was already casting another spell. Thus, the moment the Hydra withdrew back into the cenote, Zack sent a pair of pale blue balls of magical energy after it. Zorian would later find out that the projectiles were meant to freeze the water at the bottom of the cenote, hopefully imprisoning the Hydra in a block of ice. Unfortunately for that idea, the Hydra didn't retreat back into the water. It simply ducked out of the path of Zack's attack and then decided to jump out of the cenote and charge at the group. Seeing the giant Hydra jump out of the cenote with the same ease a house cat jumps onto the kitchen table really drove in the point that they were dealing with something entirely out of the ordinary. Normal Hydras were just highly venomous and capable of impressive tissue regeneration, especially in regards to their heads. They were not known to be especially fast or agile out of the water. The charge of the Hydra was unstoppable. Daiman and his team launched a constant stream of different attack spells at the Hydra, all in vain. Every projectile they launched was intercepted by the Hydra's many heads before it could hit its main body, inflicting damage that was soon undone by the Hydra's natural regeneration ability. A Hydra's regeneration was most potent in regards to its heads, even capable of overcoming fire damage and other things that usually foiled regenerators, but its main body was a lot more vulnerable. Damon's group clearly knew this, and thus aimed for the main body with every attack they made, but the Hydra was too quick and canny for this to work. Zorian refrained from joining in on the attack. If Damon's whole group couldn't break through, his addition would likely be a meaningless waste of mana. He simply focused on figuring out how its mind works, conserved his mana and repositioned his golems so he could respond in time upon spotting an appropriate opening. Fortunately, the Hydra seemed focused primarily on Zack, having identified him as its biggest threat. Well, perhaps it was a bit callous of Zorian to say that, but in his defense, Zack looked quite happy at the fact that he had attracted the Hydra's ire with his earlier spell. Seemingly ignoring the massive Hydra thundering towards him, Zack cast two lengthy spells. The first created a large ball of soft white light that just hung there above his head, seemingly doing nothing at all. The other produced no visible effects, but Zorian's magic perception was pretty good by now and he could sense 8 magical constructs suddenly springing into existence around Zack. Soon, the Hydra was close enough to Zack to attack. At that moment, all 8 heads struck, surging towards Zack like coiled springs. Somewhere behind him, Zorian could hear some member of Damon's team scream out a warning to Zack, as if that was going to do him any good now. At the same time, though, the 8 concealed spell constructs surrounding Zack also sprang into motion, surging forward to meet the Hydra's heads. 8 spectral shark jaws faded into existence, already in the process of biting down towards the attacking heads. The Hydra, suddenly realizing it had blundered into a trap, tried to abort its attack. It was too late. It was too big and had too much momentum. Whatever magic gave it such abnormal speed and agility had its limits. The spectral jaws slammed shut, slicing through Hydra's scale and muscle alike with ridiculous ease. Panicked, the Hydra seemed to dip into some secret reserves of strength that allowed it to quickly extricate most of its heads before they were bitten off. Most, but not all. One of the spectral jaws caught its target particularly well and then kept biting down. With a loud crunch, the jaws bit right through the Hydra head spine, separating it from the main body. The Hydra's remaining 7 heads roared in pain and anger, the headless neck of its 8th head flailing around madly and spraying blood everywhere around it. This wasn't a wound its regeneration could fix. The head wasn't damaged, it was just plain gone. It would regrow in time, but this process would happen too slowly to have any influence on the outcome of this battle. Zorian expected that Zack would now use the mysterious ball of white light floating above his head, but the spell remained inert. Instead, he once again created a field of stone blades in front of him. Before he could launch it at the Hydra, however, it suddenly retracted its heads closer to its main body and wrapped itself into something resembling a scaly, fleshy sphere. Then it disappeared into thin air. When it appeared again, it was suddenly next to Daimon and his group. Of course it can teleport as well, Zorian mumbled to himself. It should have been more surprising. Teleportation magic was usually very impractical for large creatures, because the costs increased explosively with the volume of the thing being teleported. Instead, it almost seemed appropriate. Zorian by now strongly suspected that they were dealing with some kind of ancient guardian from Awantembi's time, back when gods still meddled in mortal affairs and granted potent powers to those that caught their fancy. It was to be expected that something like this would be equipped with strange and potent abilities. He pointed at the air in front of him and a large, semi-transparent disk of force materialized in the air before him. Zorian hopped onto it and flew off in the direction of the Hydra. He was fine with letting Zack face the Hydra on his own, but Daimon and the people around him would probably need his help to stay alive. Hasana, who was still near Zorian by this point, copied his trick and followed after him on a force disk of his own. The sudden teleportation, while very impressive from a creature that big, seemed to take a lot out of the Hydra. Instead of striking immediately, it took a few seconds to uncoil and catch its breath before attacking again. This blunted some of the shock among Damon's group and allowed them to organize themselves somewhat before it struck. When it did strike, however, it was devastating. A layer of shields was erected in front of the group, but it was smashed into rapidly fading smoke and motes of light in under a second. Desperate to keep the Hydra away from himself and his men, Daimon conjured a giant ectoplasmic version of himself, which then physically tackled the Hydra. The giant ghostly Daimon snatched two of the Hydra's heads with its ghostly hands and tried to wrestle it to the ground. This didn't quite work, but it did keep three of the Hydra's heads too busy to attack anyone else and stopped it from moving freely on the battlefield, so it wasn't really a failure either. Kerma fired a swarm of drill-like projectiles at the Hydra, each of them unerringly homing in on the Hydra's sensitive points: eyes, mouth, ears, nostrils. This was rather remarkable, as most homing spells were not nearly that precise in their aiming. Especially since the miniature drills were moving with incredible speeds, which would further complicate homing functions of most spells. Zorian could only imagine the Lotus machine she carried was somehow responsible for that feat. Zorian would have thought Orisa would be entirely useless in this kind of fight, since the Hydra was unlikely to even notice bee stings. However, she surprised him. Her bees suddenly became encased in an orange aura that caused the air around them to ripple from the intense heat emanating off them. From that point on, they flew faster and burned all that they touched, like 1,000 tiny flying furnaces. Occasionally she would make a quick gesture, causing some of the bees to detonate, creating tiny but intense explosions that charred the Hydra's tough, scaly skin wherever they touched it. And because the bees were so tiny, they could simply fly past the more durable, regenerating heads and strike at the Hydra's main body. Zorian also added some pressure on the Hydra himself, launching a force lance, an incinerating beam and two severing discs at the Hydra as he flew towards the battle site. He didn't really think he would inflict real damage with that, but every second the Hydra spent on dealing with those attacks was a second it couldn't spare on dealing with Daimon and the others. Despite all of these efforts, the Hydra still had 7 heads left, and it was hard to keep them all constantly busy. Zorian had to sacrifice one of his golems to save Orisa from having her head bitten off when the Hydra finally figured out where the annoying burning, exploding bees were coming from. Torin also sacrificed one of his larger eyes to survive an attack, causing the eye in question to burst into a copious amount of translucent slime that formed a thin, rubbery dome around him. The head that was targeting him bit down on the dome and, despite its apparent flimsiness, failed to punch through. The dome bent and stretched, but did not break. Unfortunately, not everyone targeted by the Hydra had such a life-saving method prepared. One of the mages was bitten nearly in half before anyone could do anything about it, dying on the spot. The other had his arm pumped full of venom when the Hydra grazed it with its jaws. Daimon immediately cut off the limb in question and then directed one of the mages to teleport him and all the other wounded away from the battlefield. Additionally, one of the men tried to circle the Hydra and attack it from behind, only to have his legs shattered in response when the Hydra revealed that its tail was also a potent weapon, able to strike at things with great force and speed. Zorian didn't begrudge the man his agonized screaming. He still remembered how much it had hurt when the Grey Hunter had done the same to him. Finally, Daimon found a good moment to spring his trap. The Hydra managed to get through some of the defensive spells and sent one of its heads towards Daimon, who threw a mundane-looking red projectile at it. Sensing no great danger, the Hydra simply bit down on the projectile to make it go away, shattering the potion bottle hidden inside the projectile right inside its mouth. The Hydra as a whole flinched back as it sensed the alchemical mixture pour down its throat, stopping all of its attacks. The affected head released an agonizing scream as it rapidly began to transform into glittering white crystal. Its natural regeneration was unable to halt the process, and it seemed inevitable that the entire Hydra would rapidly crystallize and turn into a lifeless, glittering statue. Without hesitation, one of the Hydra's other heads bit down on the neck of the rapidly crystallizing head and tore it off in a shower of blood and gore. Now down to 6 heads, but safe from the crystallization poison, the Hydra gave Daimon a murderous look and prepared for another charge. Unfortunately for the Hydra, this was when Zack, Zorian and Hasana reached the battlefield and the tide shifted. Hasana circled the battlefield, casting barrier after barrier and preventing anyone else from being killed or seriously wounded by the Hydra's multitude of attacks. Zorian had figured out enough of its mind to start messing with its aim and timing, and occasionally launched combat spells at it as well when he spotted a good opening. Then there was Zack. Unlike Zorian and Hasana, he didn't bother with a force disk when the Hydra teleported away from him. He simply jumped into the air and flew off towards the new battlefield like it was the most normal thing in the world, his 8 spectral jaws in tow. The mysterious white orb was still floating over his head, too. As he traveled, another 3 identical orbs joined the one he made earlier, equally passive for now. When he finally reached the Hydra, the spectral jaws that trailed behind him surged forward, biting towards it, and it was instantly put on the defensive. Naturally, this was when the Hydra pulled another one of its surprise abilities. It roared again, breathing clouds of bright green gas in every direction. Everyone was forced to temporarily retreat from what was likely some kind of poison mist, giving the Hydra some much-needed respite. The battle continued. The Hydra lost another head, then 2. The Hydra managed to rob Zack of all of his spectral jaws and wounded another one of Damon's men. Zorian managed to hit the Hydra's main body with a shredder sphere, inflicting a lasting wound on it. All of his golems ended up being reduced to scrap, however. Damon's ectoplasmic giant was dispersed, but Daimon managed to slice off its tail in response. At first glance, it seemed like they were winning and that victory was only a matter of time, but the truth was that they were steadily running out of mana. The Hydra might be on the verge of collapse, but so were they. Even Zack's seemingly inexhaustible mana reserves were starting to run out. They didn't want to retreat. At least one person was dead, many had suffered serious injuries, and they had used a lot of expensive resources during the course of the battle. On top of that, while the Hydra was grievously wounded, it would recover quickly if it was left alone. Far faster than their group would. If they fled and came back later, it would probably be back in top health, with all of its heads back. The Hydra didn't want to retreat either. It had only 3 of its heads left, but it knew it could recover from this setback very quickly. Its enemies were visibly weakening, it just had to keep going and outlast them. Besides, turning its back to such dangerous enemies was lunacy. All of its instincts were telling it that doing so would be a mistake. Better to risk fighting to the bitter end than be cut down from the back as it fled. In the end, though, they had all underestimated Zack again. Sometime during the fighting, Zack had created another white ball to join the 4 he had prepared earlier. He then spent the rest of the battle arranging the 5 balls around the battlefield and trying to maneuver the Hydra into the center of their formation. Although no one except Zack knew what they were supposed to do, his performance was impressive enough that everyone did their best to help him with this. The Hydra was wary of the balls in the beginning, but as time passed and they remained little more than glowing ornaments, it began to mostly ignore them. Eventually, Daimon instructed his men to feign a panicked rout and the Hydra recklessly followed after them, stepping right in the middle of the resulting formation. In that very moment, Zack made a strange hand sign and the balls activated. A web of brightly shining threads unfolded out of them, reaching across empty space to intertwine with each other and trap the Hydra under a dome of delicate-looking threads. The Hydra experimentally brushed against the dome of threads and hissed in pain as they lacerated its flesh like 1,000 interlocking razors. And then the dome began to shrink. Everyone watched, exhausted, as the giant Hydra futilely fought to break out of the dome of razor threads closing in on it. It bellowed in rage again and again, defiant to the very end. Finally, with its entire body mangled and only one head left intact, it once again curled into a ball and teleported out of the sphere. Unlike the first teleport, this one did not take it very far. In fact, the Hydra appeared right next to the rapidly shrinking sphere, having transported itself just far enough to escape immediate death. It swayed on its feet as it unrolled, looking as if it was going to keel over dead at any moment. However, before that could happen, it lifted its head one last time and gave Daimon a bitter, murderous look. Though it was actually Zack that was responsible for its current predicament, it had been chasing after Daimen and his men when it blundered into the trap, and it viewed him as the primary culprit of its current predicament. Through his magic perception, Zorian suddenly detected a massive buildup of magic in the Hydra. In fact, virtually everyone seemed to have detected it, considering how they flinched in surprise. Before anyone could do anything, the Hydra opened its last remaining mouth and fired a beam of pitch-black energy straight at Daimen. Eyes widening, Daimen reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming mirror, thrusting it in front of himself as some kind of shield. The beam hit. The mirror shattered as if hit by a bomb, the sound of its destruction reverberating throughout the surroundings with unnatural loudness. Daimen himself was blown back like a rag doll, the arm that held the mirror clearly broken. The black beam was gone, however, as if it had never existed in the first place. For a full second, the Hydra seemed to stare at the scene. Then, it shuddered for a moment and collapsed to the side, dead. The battle was over. The immediate aftermath of the fight was, in many ways, more nerve-wracking for Zorian than the actual fight had been. After checking up on everyone, it turned out that only one person had actually died in the fighting: Goliri Ardit, the guy that got bitten in half by the Hydra near the start of the fighting. However, Goliri was best friends with one of the other men in the group, Alachi Gotram. Alachi was devastated and furious that his friend had died, and he felt the primary person responsible for his death was Zorian. It had been Zorian who had insisted that they had to gain access to the deepest cave in the cenote, after all. The man had kept hurling insults at Zorian for over 5 minutes, and even tried to attack him physically before Zack intervened. Unfortunately, that's when 2 more members of Damon's team spoke up in support of Alachi. The guy who had lost his arm due to the Hydra's poison and the man who'd had his legs shattered by its tail were also very unhappy. They were essentially crippled, and they likewise blamed Zorian for it. Likely Zack as well, but they were too intimidated by his combat prowess to piss him off. Zorian, on the other hand, looked like an easier target. During all of that, Daimen tried to play peacemaker and calm his men down, but he never expressed any support for Zorian. This pissed off Zorian more than it probably should have. He knew that this was his team and that he couldn't just categorically side with Zorian just because he was his brother, but it left a bitter taste in his mouth that Daimen hadn't said so much as a single word in his defense. Instead, it was Hasana who eventually sided with him. The old man seemed to have taken a liking to Zorian. This started another round of accusations concerning Zorian's obvious proficiency in mind magic, with Alachi claiming Zorian was clearly mind-controlling people and that police should get involved. The moment police involvement was mentioned, Daimen seemed to shift tracks in his methods of resolving the conflict. He stopped the discussion, dragged Alachi to the side and erected a privacy ward around the 2 of them. Zorian had no idea what was said between them, but Alachi no longer bothered him after this. As for the 2 crippled mages, Daimen told them that their wounds weren't necessarily unrecoverable with the right treatments and promised to pay as much as he had to in order to get them back in top shape. This seemed to mellow them out a lot, and they no longer made any fuss either. With that particular crisis somewhat resolved, they could finally inspect their gains. They dropped off most of the wounded at the nearest hospital. Daimen decided to just put his broken arm in a cast and return to the field, and gated back to the site of the battle. The first gain was actually the dead Hydra. Daimen and his team were quite excited about its potential worth. The sums involved weren't much to Zorian, but that was just the time loop messing with his sense of proportion when it came to money. If they could really find an appropriate buyer for this thing, the Hydra could get Daimen and his team enough money to turn a lot of heads. The dead chameleon drakes would also be gathered and sold, although their value was far less than that of a Hydra. Especially since Zack's spells had really made a mess out of a lot of them, making many of the corpses borderline useless. As they walked around, inspecting chameleon drake corpses, Zorian heard Daimen complaining to Orisa about his broken mirror. Apparently it was a divine artifact that Daimen had found on one of his expeditions and decided to keep. It was supposed to be utterly indestructible, and had saved Damon's life many times in the past, and now it was gone. He was thoroughly heartbroken over that, and Orissa pointing out that at least he was alive thanks to its sacrifice didn't seem to cheer him up much. "Ready, little Kaczynski," Torin said, slapping Zorian on the back a little harder than was necessary. "Let's go get that orb that you're so sure is down there, eh?" Zorian said nothing. Before descending into the depths of the cenote, the group carefully checked the place again in order to see if there were any more giant magical hydras or worse things lurking nearby. They found no evidence of such, but they also failed to figure out how they had missed the hydra in the first place, which was worrying. The water at the bottom was frozen as a result of the 2 projectiles that Zack had sent down here at the start of the fight, but there was no evidence of any kind of underwater cave the hydra could have hidden itself in. It was like the hydra simply popped into existence out of nowhere when the chameleon drakes called for it. When they finally entered the cave Zorian had pointed out, the orb was nowhere to be found. Zorian expected as much, though, and wasn't really worried. "Can you still sense it?" Daimen asked anxiously. He was probably a bit desperate to get some tangible results from gaining access to this place, so that he could justify the losses he suffered to get here both to himself and to others. "I can," Zorian confirmed. He walked towards the far end of the cave and jabbed his finger at the empty air in front of him. "It's here. It's at this exact spot, even." He waved his hand through the air where he sensed the orb and it passed through it without resistance. "Yet I can't actually see it, or even touch it," Zorian added. How curious. Everyone who had even the slightest amount of expertise in divinations, or detection magic in general, immediately gathered around the spot, poking, staring and casting magic at it. After 10 minutes of that, Daimen finally got a result. "I can't believe this," Daimen said, running his hand through his hair in annoyance. "You have something?" Kerma asked hopefully. "It's a hidden world," Daimen said. "A what?" Zorian asked, having never encountered that term before. "A pocket dimension, like the one you think Silver Lake is hiding in," Zack told him. "They are normally almost impossible to find unless you know exactly what to look for. Thus, some people call them hidden worlds. So this spot that little Kaczynski has pointed out?" Torin asked hesitantly. "An entrance to the pocket dimension where the orb resides," Daimen said, giving Zorian a complex look. "Damn it. All of Awantembi's other belongings are probably there too. No wonder we hadn't found any trace of his group in all this time. We would have never found this without Zorian, even if we had spent years combing this place. But we did have him, and thus the expedition is saved," Torin said with a careless shrug. "What are you being so gloomy about?" "What indeed," Daimen mumbled. "Anyway, now we just have to figure out how to break through this invisible door thing and we'll be free to loot Awantembi's tomb to our heart's content, yes?" Torin asked. "Yes, but I'd like to point out that this is probably where the giant magical hydra had come from," Asana butted in. "What if there are more of them inside? What if there are worse things waiting for us there? We shouldn't be reckless." "Yes, Hasana is right," Daimen nodded. "We lost too much here as it is. I want to hire more fighters before we try to set foot there. I'd like to stay here for a while and study the entrance point for a bit," Zorian said, frowning. "Something doesn't feel right about this." "Fine," Daimen sighed. "But don't do anything before consulting me. Look, but don't touch." Zorian nodded. Over the next 2 hours he scrutinized the pocket dimension entrance point while paying attention to the way his marker reacted to it. He also asked Daimen to teach him whatever spells he had used to confirm the presence of a pocket dimension. Daimen mumbled something about how he would normally charge an arm and a leg for a confidential magic like that, but taught him the spells anyway. After 2 hours had passed, he was finally certain of his conclusions. He called Daimen over and asked him for permission to do something. "Something?" Daimen said warily. "Something," Zorian nodded. And if I refuse, you and Zack are going to come back here when my back is turned and do it anyway, he surmised. Well, Zorian hesitated. Absolutely, yeah, Zack immediately confirmed. Zorian gave him an annoyed glance. Not that he disagreed with his fellow time traveler, far from it, but he could have been more diplomatic about it. Daimen cupped his face in his hand for a moment. Perhaps he was imagining things, but Zorian thought he heard a brief prayer for patience directed to one of the silent divinities. Just tell me what you want to do, okay? Daimen finally said. I want to think we've misread the situation, Zorian said. It's not that the orb of the first emperor is hidden away in a pocket dimension. The pocket dimension is the orb of the first emperor. Daimen gave him a blank look. Zorian took this as an indication he should keep going. I agree with you that we're dealing with a pocket dimension, Zorian said. But my marker is quite insistent that the dimensional anchor we're looking at is not just an entrance to a pocket dimension. It is the very orb we're looking for. This may sound a little crazy, but you think the orb is a portable hidden realm, Daimen surmised. Yes, Zorian nodded. I think this entrance we're looking at is simply how the orb looks when it is deployed. I see, Daimen said speculatively. And you think you can collapse it back into an actual orb? I'm willing to try, at least, Zorian said. Though you should probably get yourself and your team out of the cenote before I make the attempt. Just in case. After a few seconds, Daimen turned towards his team, who had been silently listening to the conversation, and told them to establish a defensive perimeter around the pocket dimension entrance and a fallback point outside the cave. It seemed he had no intention of letting him and Zack try this on their own. Zorian clacked his tongue unhappily. If things went south again, he had no doubt that most of these people would blame him for everything again. Well, to hell with them, he was still doing this. The moment Daimen announced that everything was prepared and that he could begin, he cupped his hand below the invisible dimensional anchor and tried to connect to the orb with his marker. It took some tries, but he eventually succeeded. The surrounding space rippled like hot summer air for a moment, after which something resembling a glass globe materialized in the air and plopped down onto Zorian's waiting palm. Orb of the First Emperors, obtained. After a second of shocked silence, everyone rushed forward, uncomfortably crowding Zorian's personal space in order to take a look at the artifact. The orb in Zorian's hand looked interesting. The orb was a perfect sphere of crystal clear glass, completely unmarred by the passage of time. Running his fingers over it, Zorian could not feel even the slightest scratch on its surface. Seemingly encased inside the glass was a ruined palace, partially destroyed and overgrown with trees, vines, and other vegetation. The palace and the trees were extremely detailed and lifelike, to the point that Zorian could count the individual leaves on the trees if he focused on them long enough. It reminded Zorian of one of those novelty snow globes that Sciorian merchants liked to sell, the ones that had high-quality models of famous buildings encased in the glass. Eventually Zorian handed the orb to Zack, if only so people would crowd around him instead of Zorian in order to get a good look at the orb. That palace, it's not just a model, is it? Zack said, sounding fascinated. It's a real thing, contained inside the orb. Obviously, Orisa said. Why would it be a ruin otherwise? So Shuddha made himself a portable palace to carry around with him at all times? Zack asked rhetorically. I like it. Yes, now imagine just how much stuff could be stored there, Torin said happily. Ah, little Kaczynski, I forgive you for everything. You're the best thing to have happened to this team. Although Zorian was dying to study the orb in more detail, he had reluctantly decided to leave the orb in Damon's hands for now. Trying to take it away would probably spark another fight, and it wasn't like he had enough time to truly devote himself to its study right now. The attack on the Abasan base beneath Scioria was fast approaching, which meant that both Zack and Zorian would be forced to devote the majority of their energies into that for the next couple of days. I have to say, this whole thing makes me feel very conflicted, Zack said as they left the group. Why? Zorian asked curiously. Well, on one hand, we only found the orb so quickly because Men pointed us at the right spot to start at, Zack said. So if we ever get out of the time loop, the right thing to do would probably be tell him how to get it as a thanks for his help. But? Zorian prompted. I really like the idea of having my own portable palace, Zack said with a dreamy grin. Zorian snorted derisively. You shouldn't get excited just yet. For all we know, the ruins really are full of slumbering giant hydras or something. That just makes me more excited, Zack said. That thing was a great opponent. Clearing a whole nest of them would be amazing. Oh, right. For a moment he had forgotten who he was talking with. They spent the rest of the way home arguing about what the best setup for a modern portable palace would look like. The main point of contention was that Zack wanted to make an arena full of actual monsters to fight with, whereas Zorian argued that sophisticated training dummies were better because they were less likely to break out of their containment and rampage throughout the entire place. It's just not the same, Zack complained, shaking his head sadly. In the end they had to agree to disagree on the issue. All the preparations were complete. Soldiers were recruited, human mercenaries and Arania hired, golems made, wild monsters dominated into serving as combat support, additional equipment bought and several limited combat exercises performed. The scale of the operation was sufficiently big that the authorities had sent a team to investigate what was happening, requiring some quick mind magic and forged documents to avert disaster. It helped that many houses had small, or not so small, in some cases, private armies to protect their interests, and that many of these houses had estates in or around Scioria, which made their group stand out a lot less than it might otherwise. All that was left to do now was to wait for Quatakikl to leave for Oquin Ibesa so they could make their move. There was some worry about that, as Quatakikl didn't seem to be getting ready to leave. Svim had raised the issue that they might have tipped Quatakikl off somehow, and a fierce discussion sprung up about whether to go ahead with the assault anyway if that was the case. Thankfully, the question turned out to be irrelevant in the end. Quatakikl still left on schedule, and the mission could proceed. The first task was simple: kidnap Sudamir, hopefully neutralizing the entire Ayaska mansion in the process. In order to do that, though, they had to lure the man out of his nigh unassailable home. Thus, Zack and Zorian stole a pair of fancy red robes from the Cult of the World Dragon and teleported to Nyazov Dveri, where they proceeded to smash up storefronts, set several warehouses on fire and used alteration to call out Sudamir as a traitor to the esoteric order of the Celestial Dragon. Zorian also used his mind magic to guide a herd of wild boars directly into the town square, after which he released his control over them and let them run amok as they pleased. The city guard tried to stop them, of course. They were actually pretty brutal about it, going so far as to have snipers try to pick them off from the rooftops, despite the fact that Zack and Zorian clearly avoided killing anyone themselves. Still, they were barely a challenge. Zack and Zorian simply knocked them out or otherwise incapacitated them, and then continued with their extended provocation. After a while they stopped with the attack and left. This was partially because they were afraid Sudamir might opt not to show up if he thought the danger had not yet passed, but it was also because there was a chance the city authorities would call in Eldamar's military if things went on long enough. It took nearly 5 hours for Sudamir to show up in the city, upon which he was greeted by irate shop owners and city officials, demanding an explanation and some kind of compensation. Not even the 12 dangerous-looking, grim-faced bodyguards that followed after him everywhere could make them pause. Zack and Zorian observed for a while and then struck like a lightning bolt. Sudamir himself got incapacitated early in the fight, and the 12 bodyguards he had brought with him turned out to be decidedly average and unable to deal with them. Especially since they weren't trying not to kill anyone this time. "I'm glad the kidnapping went off without a problem," Alanik told them when they dragged Sudamir back to their base, "but did you really have to cut off his arms?" "Don't look at me," Zack protested. "It was Zorian's idea. He's a dangerous necromancer," Zorian defended himself. I couldn't risk him hitting us with some nasty piece of soul magic in the middle of the battle, and this was the quickest way I knew of stopping that from happening. He said he was hard to kill, so I figured that he wouldn't die from blood loss. I can't believe my previous selves thought you weren't brutal enough, Alanik mumbled under his breath. And why is he not unconscious? I thought we agreed you'd knock him out before bringing him here. We couldn't knock him out, Zack admitted. We tried 5 different drugs on him, and none of them worked. Though he did pretend to be unconscious after we hit him with the 5th one, Zorian pointed out. Zack wanted to try knocking him out, the old-fashioned way, by hitting him in the head with a rock, but I vetoed that. So we just glued his mouth shut, tied his legs together, put a bag over his head and brought him over. I see, Alanik said, looking in the direction of Sudamir's brand new prison cell with a frown. I wonder what he did to himself to get such resilience. Well, you'll have plenty of time to find out, Zack shrugged. Later, though. We should be starting the assault on the gate now, yes? Not yet, no, Alanik said, shaking his head. Let's ask Sudamir a few questions concerning the Abasin base. He might know some crucial detail about its defenses or some such. Both Zack and Zorian were anxious to launch the assault as soon as possible, both because that would give the researchers more time to study the gate if they succeeded, and because the longer they waited, the bigger the chance the Abasins would realize what was coming and raise the alarm. However, Alanik's suggestion made a lot of sense, and he knew more about these sort of mass engagements than they did. If he thought a few more hours spent interrogating Sudamir wouldn't doom the operation, he was probably right. The interrogation turned out to be fairly mundane and unexciting. Sudamir was surprisingly calm and polite for someone who had been brutally attacked in broad daylight, de-armed, and then carried off for mind magic-assisted interrogation. It didn't even take all that much mind magic to make him tell the truth. However, he also did not seem to know anything terribly useful about the layout and defenses of the Abasin base. Sudamir and the Abasins may have been cooperating closely with each other, but neither side fully trusted the other, and a lot of things were kept secret between them. Eventually the 3 of them ran out of questions to ask, much sooner than they expected they would. Well, they ran out of questions related to the Abasin base, anyway. Rather than stop, Alanik simply decided to expand the scope of the questioning beyond that topic. This wasn't exactly what they agreed on, but Zorian said nothing for now. He could sense that Alanik's questions were all building up to something. Some question that Alanik desperately wanted answered. Why are you gathering so many souls in your mansion? Alanik eventually asked Sudamir. What on earth do you need 500,000 souls for? Ah, so that was what was bothering him. What? Asked Sudamir, sounding shocked for the first time since the questioning began. How do you know that? Alanik gestured toward Zorian, who immediately launched a mental assault on Sudamir's mind, forcing him to answer the question. GHK. Sudamir grunted, grinding his teeth as he fought against the compulsion. Damn it, that's not it, I need it. For what? Alanik pushed. For the wraith bombs, Sudamir ground out eventually. Wraith bombs? Zack asked curiously. As in, you pack a wraith into a bomb and throw it at people? Haha, yes. Yes. Sudamir said, suddenly breaking into hysterical laughter. He was no longer fighting against Zorian's mental compulsion for some reason, as if he realized there was no way he could win there and decided to just give them exactly what they want. Not just one wraith though. Hundreds. Thousands even. And you don't throw them at people. No, you throw them at cities. What? Zack asked, frowning. Wraiths can multiply, Alanik said quietly. Give a wraith some time and lots of victims, and it will make another wraith out of every human whose soul it consumes. Yes, exactly. Sudamir said, nodding furiously. Just think of what would happen if you dumped thousands of these things in the middle of a major city. Unless the outbreak is contained immediately, the whole city would be overwhelmed in a matter of hours. Only the Triumvirate Church has enough experts in ghost fighting to counter a wraith outbreak after it gathers some steam, and they were decimated in the weeping. If I had enough wraith bombs in my possession, Eldamar would have to appease me. They'd have to. There was a brief silence during which Sudamir seemed to get lost in his own world and everyone else was processing what he just said. You'd have to use this wraith bomb of yours on at least one city before anyone took your threat seriously, Zorian eventually pointed out. Yes, of course, Sudamir said, giving him a patient look, as if he was asked something obvious by a small child. That goes without saying. I was thinking of targeting Solimnon first. That would immediately spark another round of splinter wars. Solimnon wouldn't care about any excuses from Eldamar's government. Not if it was obvious that the wraith bomb came from Eldamar. With another continental conflict underway, Eldamar would have no forces to spare on suppressing me. In fact, they would surely be tempted to make use of my assets to help them win the war. For a moment, Sudamir looked like he was about to continue with his explanation, but then he suddenly froze up and some of the mania that had taken over him seemed to drain out of him. Only for a moment, though. Almost immediately, the spark of madness returned to his eyes once again, except this time it was slightly different. There was violence and aggression lurking there now, and his face twisted into an outraged snarl. Sudamir's flesh suddenly turned green and his body started to swell in size. He grew a tail and horns, his eyes became slitted and his teeth sharpened to dagger-like points. Zorian, who had actually seen Sudamir transformed into a giant monster once before, realized what he was looking at and started to shout out a warning to Zack and Alanik. Alanik was already reacting, though. The moment Sudamir started to transform, he rushed up to him and slammed his palm against his chest. A multitude of yellow ribbons covered in some sort of religious writing sprang into existence around Sudamir. They circled around the captured necromancer once before sinking into his flesh, causing the transformation to stop and Sudamir to be instantly wrenched back to his human form. Sudamir stared at Alanik in shock for a full second, at a loss for words. "Oh," he finally said. "Well. That didn't work out as well as I hoped." Alanik made a slashing motion with his left hand and then lightly poked Sudamir on the forehead with his index finger. This caused Sudamir to suddenly become wreathed in dark red light and then collapse into unconsciousness. "Let's go," Alanik said, motioned for Zack and Zorian to follow him out of the cell. "We'll continue this interrogation later. For now, we have an Abasin base to capture." Deep beneath Scioria, in a recently excavated cavern separated from the main tunnel network, an army was being assembled. It consisted of about 200 people, about 120 of which had been gathered by Alanik through various means while the rest were mercenaries Zorian had hired for considerable amounts of money. Of course, this number did not include the many non-combat experts that would be responsible for figuring out how the Abasin gate functioned. Nor did it take into account the many golems that Zorian had made for the occasion, about 80 of which were scattered through the area, or the 40 Iranian mercenaries that were hired from the 3 different webs recommended by the Silent Doorway adepts. As far as armies went, this wasn't much. But it was still a sizable group, and getting it past Abasin patrols without them noticing their passage was difficult. For ordinary mages, that is. Zorian could just send his simulacrum to sneak past these patrols and then just open a gate to let the assembled forces through unmolested and unnoticed. There was something very amusing about using dimensional gates to bypass Abasin patrols, establishing a temporary staging ground deep in their territory, and then launching a surprise attack at their base. Zorian was just in the process of attaching small metal cylinders to his belt, each one filled with potent alchemical mixtures, when he sensed Zack approaching him. "You look worried," Zack told him. Zorian frowned. He didn't notice it before Zack pointed it out, but yeah. He kind of was. "A little," Zorian admitted, continuing his preparations. "I mean, we're risking another confrontation with Quatakikl here. He's one of the few people who has the ability to do us lasting harm. Every time we tangle with him, we're taking a big risk. It'll be fine, Zack said dismissively, giving him a strong pat on the back that had Zorian swaying in place for a second. He gave Zack a glare for that, but his fellow time traveler just grinned at him in response. Besides, the annoying pile of bones isn't nearly as dangerous as you think. I've fought him plenty of times, and I'm still standing. He doesn't like to use necromancy in battle for some reason. Alanik, who was staring at the map of the Abasin base along with Svim, decided this merited a response from him. Most necromantic spells aren't well suited for battle, Alanik said, not taking his eyes off the map. They take too much concentration and they need to overcome the target's magic resistance to work. It's faster and cheaper to just burn people to a crisp or cut them to pieces. The terrible necromantic spells that are sometimes bandied about in textbooks are torture spells meant to be inflicted on a subdued victim, not something you use in an even fight. There was a long pause as Zack and Zorian digested this. One of these days, Zorian decided, he really had to ask Alanik about his past. The old battle priest would likely refuse to talk about it at first, but maybe if he picked a right moment and was really persistent. Well, whatever. It was a thought for some other time. He considered pointing out that a fight between them and Quatakikl wasn't exactly an even one, since the difference in power and skill between the ancient lich and any one of them was still a yawning chasm rather than anything resembling a close matchup, but he figured that would be missing the point. Alanik's point was that Quatakikl likely didn't go for necromantic magic in a fight because it was suboptimal, and that was probably true. Getting into a habit of toying with your opponents was quite stupid, and the ancient lich had been shrewd enough to survive for more than 1,000 years now. Truth be told, Zorian found those jagged disintegration beams that Quatakikl liked to use to be plenty terrifying in their own way. You know, Zorian suddenly said. My past self would be horrified if he saw me right now. Why? Zack asked, arching his eyebrow in askance. This attack is pretty audacious, said Zorian. There is no way my past self would ever consider this a reasonable risk to take. A part of me scoffs at this, dismissing it as simple cowardice, but there is another part of me that can't help but wonder whether the time loop had eroded away my ability to recognize what is and is not appropriately cautious behavior. What if we managed to leave the time loop and deal with Red Robe, only to die 2 months later because we did something completely stupid out of sheer habit? To Zorian's surprise, Zack actually seemed to give the question some serious thought. Zorian expected him to either dismiss his concerns or question how Zorian could possibly know what his past self would have thought of their current situation. Instead, Zack seemed to consider the issue in his head for well over a minute before responding. I doubt that's going to happen, he eventually said, his tone and mannerisms somewhat subdued. I have things I need to do after we get out. Social things. It will be at least a year or two before I can start picking fights with dragons or whatnot, and I don't think you'll start looking for trouble without me prodding you. A couple of years should be enough to let us adjust to a world without restarts, right? Zorian simply gave Zack a non-committal hum in response. Zack had a pretty rosy picture of Zorian in his head if he thought there was no way he could get himself into trouble on his own. Zorian still wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life if when they got out of the time loop, but he would probably need a lot of money and rare resources. He could easily imagine getting into trouble in the process of acquiring these, or once he amassed enough that people start to take notice, or once he told people what he was actually doing with all these acquisitions. Zack's inordinate fondness for picking fights with giant monsters was definitely dangerous, but Zorian suspected his personal ambitions could be even more dangerous than that. A mage of Zack's caliber can usually flee from giant monsters if they find themselves overmatched against it. Make a human organization interested enough in you, though, and they will hound you till the day you die. He shook his head and steeled himself. Now was not the time to contemplate those topics too deeply. The opening moves of this attack were about to begin and Zorian had a crucial role to play in them. If they wanted to stop Quatakikl from being alerted and summoned back to the base, someone had to sneak into the base and either assassinate or disable as many Abasin leaders as possible before the main force of the attack hit. That someone was, of course, Zorian. Him and the Iranian mercenaries he had hired for the occasion, that is. Cloaking one's presence thoroughly enough to avoid dedicated scrutiny was quite hard. In a contest between two equally skilled mages, one of which was trying to hide and one of which was seeking for the hidden one, the seeker would almost always come out on top. If your opponent could manipulate your very mind, however, dictating what you see, hear and remember, then even the most sophisticated detection spell could not help you find them. Well, that was the theory, at least. Zorian was quite sure the Abasins would catch on to their presence relatively soon. Mind magic was not exactly unknown among mages, even if few of them could manifest it as stealthily and flexibly as Zorian and his new Iranian minions could. Still, they didn't have to stay undetected forever, just long enough to track down and remove anyone who knew how to contact Quetzalcoatl. "I'm going," Zorian said out loud, speaking to himself as much as he was to the people around him. "Leave a simulacrum with us," warned Alanik. Zorian hesitated for a moment. He had dismissed all his simulacrums before the operation began so that they wouldn't be a drain on his mana reserves. It was annoying, because it meant he would have to rely on Daimen again to re-establish a link with Koth, but he felt this operation deserved his full focus. That said, Zorian shouldn't be doing anything too mana-intensive during the initial infiltration, so maybe leaving a simulacrum behind in the command room wouldn't be a bad idea. He executed a complex series of chants and gestures and then cupped his hands in front of him, causing a milky white sphere of ectoplasm to materialize in front of him. He felt the spell reach towards his soul, connecting it to the ball of ectoplasm in front of him. The moment he felt the connection snap into place, he plunged his right arm straight into the ball of ectoplasm and imposed upon it an image of himself, causing it to squirm and writhe like a living thing. "That always looks so freaky," Zack commented off to the side. Zorian ignored him. This was the most sensitive part of the spell, since the caster had to keep their image firmly in mind as they manipulated the ectoplasm. If they faltered even for a second, the spell would either fail or produce a hopelessly false copy. This was because, although the spell was tapping into the caster's soul to create the copy, it was tapping into something that described a creature of flesh and blood and trying to translate it into a form made out of magical fields and ectoplasm. A multitude of little and not so little sacrifices and compromises had to be made during this process, and a non-sapient spell couldn't be trusted to prioritize things properly. The first time Zorian succeeded in producing a simulacrum, for example, he got a nearly mindless wreck that nonetheless contained a vividly detailed internal bone structure. The spell sacrificed nearly everything else to get that one thing just right. Of course, Zorian was now too well versed with the spell to fail like that, even with Zack distracting him with inane comments. The writhing sphere swelled in size and erupted into thin, rope-like pseudopods that formed a rough outline of a human being. 2 minutes later, a flawless-looking replica of Zorian opened its eyes and looked around. One would think that simulacrums would come into existence already aware of everything and ready to spring into action on a moment's notice, but in practice they always seemed a little confused after being created and took about 30 seconds to gather their bearings and calm down. "There," Zorian said. "Anything else?" "No," Alanik said, shaking his head. "Go. Try not to get yourself killed, I guess." "I guess." Zorian mumbled under his breath. "Thank you, Alanik, you really know how to make a motivational speech." And then he left. The attack on the Abasin base beneath Scioria had begun. The initial stages of the infiltration went very well. Zorian used a combination of a floating invisibility sphere and clouding the minds of the Abasin guards to smuggle himself and the Urania into the base, after which they split up into small groups to cover more ground in as little time as possible. There were some complications. For one thing, there were some pretty insidious and powerful wards scattered around the base, arranged in no pattern that Zorian could decipher. These hadn't been there when Zorian invaded the base in the previous restarts, which implied that Abasins normally took those down before executing the invasion of Scioria. Zorian was kind of baffled as to why they would tear down their own wards like that, though, even if they did intend to abandon the base after the invasion. For a moment he actually worried that they had been betrayed by some of their mercenaries, despite their precautions, and that the base security had been upgraded in response. However, the wards in question were arranged so haphazardly, the entire warding layout so full of holes, that Zorian eventually ruled out that idea. If the Abasins had been expecting them, they would have done a better job of warding the place than this. As it was, the warding setup looked almost like a collection of individual wards, each of which had been erected by a different person without bothering to consult anyone else about what they were doing. In at least 2 places the wards clashed with each other so severely that they created dead zones in the areas where they overlapped, cancelling each other out. Zorian had a rather silly urge to write a letter to Quadakikl, criticizing him for not teaching his minions how to make a proper warding scheme. This sort of thing reflected badly on him too, he ought to think of his reputation. Anyway. Another problem was the Abasins had these brown dogs that could smell the Arania coming, no matter how well cloaked, and wouldn't stop barking. And they were either naturally mind-blanked or had been made so artificially, because Zorian couldn't detect or connect to their minds at all. He had been forced to kill and replace them with motionless ectoplasmic replicas, which took an annoying amount of time and mana on his part. After that, everything went perfectly for a while. Numerous Abasin leaders were eliminated, and though the base was starting to wake up to the fact something funny was going on in their base, they were still not aware of the extent of the problem on their hands. However, there was something that Zorian had not taken into account. The Abasins had fought against Arania before. Before the time loop and even during the time loop, before Red Robe erased them from the time loop, the Sciorian web had been a huge obstacle to their operations. As such, they had a multitude of countermeasures and defenses aimed specifically against the Arania. Many of these were abandoned when the local Arania mysteriously disappeared, experts in charge of manning them reassigned to other, more productive duties, but some of them remained intact. Just in case. When the Arania moved near the center of the base, they seemed to cross some invisible line that immediately triggered a base-wide alarm. It was loud, shrill, and everyone in the base seemed to immediately realize what it meant because they immediately started layering mental protection spells on themselves and grabbing their weapons. "Oops," the Arania closest to Zorian said hesitantly. "I don't even understand what got us," another complained. "Human magic is such bullshit." Zorian snorted derisively. Well, it wasn't like this was completely unexpected. He reached out with his mind, connecting himself with the network of telepathic relays that had been densely distributed across this entire section of the underworld, and ordered the miniature monster horde he had gathered to attack the base from all directions. From one of the tunnels, a huge red centipede surged forwards, hordes of hook goblins and cave drakes following after it. The Abasins concentrated their fire at the centipede first, trying to bring down the biggest threat, only to see most of their spells fizzle out due to the many wards Zorian had attached to it. From another tunnel, a swarm of floating, jellyfish-like monsters came pouring in. They looked slow and weak, but when Abasins tried to bring them down they discovered that the jellyfish had an innate shielding magic that blocked their projectiles. Worse, the jellyfish could somehow interface with one another and merge their shields into a stronger, unified barrier. From the third tunnel, a horde of phalanx toads came rushing into the base. The Abasins killed many of them, but there were 5 more for each they killed, and they acted with unusual organization and discipline, spontaneously forming into coherent groups and sweeping everything before them with their spear-like tongues. Finally, the 4th group of monsters didn't bother moving through any of the existing tunnels. The rock worms Zorian subverted simply burst into the base from down below, having dug out their own entrance into the base. The whole plan had a high chance of falling apart at this moment, Zorian knew. Although he and the Arania had gutted a lot of their leadership, they hadn't gotten everyone that could summon Quadakikl. If the Abasins wanted to call the Ancient Lich for help, they could. However, Zorian had noticed in the past that Abasins were generally reluctant to call upon their leader. Quadakikl hated getting called to deal with trivial things. He didn't usually kill people for disappointing him in such a manner, but he was rather prone of relieving them of their positions or reducing their salary, which were horrifying enough consequences for most people. Zorian was hoping that the Abasins, faced with what appeared to be an Iranian attack, would decide to try and tackle things on their own, rather than immediately call Quatakikl to help them. Well, he seemed to have been right about that. The Abasins chose to fight the monster invasion on their own. The trouble is, they were winning. The centipede was intercepted by trolls and bludgeoned to death with sheer force of numbers, the jellyfish shield was visibly weakening and the phalanx toads were being pushed back with a liberal application of fire. As for the rock worms, well, the Abasins had rock worms of their own. Zorian had counted on the monster horde getting defeated, but not this fast. He wasn't done killing the leadership yet, damn it. He suddenly got a message from his simulacrum that Zack wanted to help out with the assassination. Well, the plan was already failing, so he supposed there was no harm in letting Zack wreck things for a bit before they abort the whole thing. As quickly as possible, he synchronized with his simulacrum and opened a gate between the command room and the Abasin base, letting Zack pass through. Zack took a rather long look at the battlefield, taking in how the battles were progressing firsthand, and then turned to Zorian. Do you know where those leaders are at the moment? Sort of. Zorian said. I mostly had the Urania pinpointing their location for me, but they're kind of busy directing the monster horde at the moment. But you know the general area they're in, right? Zack prodded. Oh yeah, Zorian nodded. He pointed at a big, solidly constructed building not far from them. Most of the surviving ones are in that building over there. The wards are pretty tricky, so it will take me some time to. Before Zorian could finish speaking, Zack had already fired some kind of projectile at the building. It was seemingly tiny, more of a faint red pinprick of light than a proper-looking offensive spell, but its flight path was followed with a piercing scream so loud it made Zorian's ears hurt. The projectile slammed into the wall of the building and then burst into crescent spatial distortions that sliced through everything in the vicinity with no visible resistance. The whole heavily warded building fell apart like an apple thrown into an industrial blender machine, burying everyone in it under several tons of rubble. One problem solved, said Zack, lowering his hand. What about the others? Well, said Zorian, a little sourly. Only a little, though truthfully, he had been expecting something like this when he agreed to involve Zack into this. If the Abasins didn't already know they're under attack by more than just Urania, they certainly do now. Let's see if we can kill them before they realize just how disgustingly powerful you are and call Quatakikl in panic. Let's, Zack agreed. Deciding there was no point in pretending this attack was just a minor Iranian offensive anymore, Zorian sent a telepathic message to Svim and Alanik to start the assault in earnest. He received a confirmation almost immediately. It seemed Zack wasn't the only one who was spoiling for a fight. Zorian understood. They had all spent so much time and resources into organizing this attack, it would be almost a crime to call it off now. It was time for Abasins to see what it's like to be suddenly invaded. Beneath the city of Scioria, a vicious battle was underway. The small army that Alanik had assembled, bolstered by the various mercenaries, Zorian's golems, and what was left of the dominated monster horde, advanced deep into the disorganized Abasin ranks. However, the Abasins weren't just passive victims. Despite having their entire high-ranking leadership gutted by Zack and Zorian, despite the huge losses they suffered in the initial attack from the monster horde, despite the shock they must have felt at the appearance of another human army, the Abasins still resisted the attack with considerable might. Their top leadership may have fallen, but local commanders quickly assumed control of the remaining forces and did their best to link up and coordinate their movements. Huge war golems charged into rapidly forming defense groups, aiming to break them up, only to be met with screaming hordes of war trolls barring their way. The Urania led the remaining monsters into suicidal offensives, only to be countered with equally suicidal delaying actions from the Abasins' own war beasts. Zack and Zorian converged on any local commander that seemed to be especially good at their job, aided by a couple of Alanik's men that seemed to be really accurate with a rifle and fond of headshots, but there was always someone whiling incapable of replacing them once they moved on to other targets. Currently, Zorian's simulacrum was standing in the vicinity of the dimensional gate at the center of the Abasin settlement, where Svim and Alanik had moved shortly after the attack began. Unfortunately, the gate had been shut down by the Abasins when they realized they were going to lose it. Another thing that didn't go according to plan. Even if they managed to win this, a powered-down gate stabilization frame was much less useful as an object of study than a working dimensional gate. "We should have brought more monsters," Alanik said suddenly, standing not far from the simulacrum and observing the battlefield. "We should have brought more everything, really, but I don't think we could have realistically recruited more people. We're doing very well compared to the numbers arrayed against us, but it's not enough. There are simply too few of us compared to the number of Abasins gathered here. We were afraid that if we sent too many monsters, it would spook them into calling Quatakikl immediately," the simulacrum pointed out. "Though considering how successful they were against the Horde, I agree we were probably too conservative with them. Speaking of which, did Zack and Zorian manage to eliminate the Abasin leaders before they contacted Quatakikl for help or not?" Svim asked. The simulacrum quickly contacted the original and asked him that same question. 10 seconds later he turned back to Svim. "It's doubtful," he said, shaking his head. "They had trouble locating the last two leaders. They're dead now, but they had plenty of time to realize how dire the situation is and call for help." Svim said nothing for a second, looking thoughtfully at the power-down gate next to them. "We shouldn't have taken the gate from them so quickly," Svim said. "We should have left it in their hands for a while to give them an avenue of retreat. I think they would have tried to fall back into that undead mansion instead of fighting a lost battle if they had a choice. Or they might have found a way to commandeer some of Sudamir's undead minions if given enough time, making our current issue even worse," the simulacrum said with a shrug. "We'll analyze what we did wrong later," said Alanik firmly. "What we need now is solutions. How do we salvage this situation?" "Shouldn't we just retreat?" asked Svim curiously. "Even if we take the base in the end, it will take us many hours to do so and cost many lives. On top of that, there is a high chance that Quatakikl will come back before we are done and tip the balance in Abasin favor." Alanik said nothing for a few seconds, clearly discontent with that idea. "I have an idea," the simulacrum eventually said. "Why don't we just rip the gate stabilization frame out of the ground, pedestal and all, and carry it off to the surface for study? I mean, the original reason why we wanted to secure the base and do our research here was because moving an active dimensional gate was impossible. But we don't have an active gate. We have an inert stabilization frame, so what stops us from simply carrying it off somewhere else before trying to figure it out?" Svim and Alanik gave him surprised looks. "What?" the simulacrum asked defensively. "The idea has merit." "It does," Alanik agreed. "I was just surprised to see you make such a suggestion. Sometimes I forget simulacrums like you are more than just extensions of Zorian and can have ideas of your own." "Same," Svim agreed. The simulacrum scowled. "Stupid flesh and blood people and their prejudices." Soon, Svim and Alanik ordered their forces to fall back a little and threw themselves into the task of cutting the gate stabilization frame free of the ground without damaging something crucial. The pedestal the frame was affixed to had some kind of root-like structure that extended into the rock beneath it, meaning that a surprisingly large chunk of the ground had to be taken along with the gate itself. None of the problems were in any way insurmountable, though, and the whole thing was soon floated into the air and slowly pushed towards one of the base exits. The movement did not go unnoticed, however, and when the Abasins saw what they were doing they went completely berserk. Apparently they really hated the idea of the gate stabilization frame being carried away like that. From that moment on, the whole battle shifted in tone. Instead of trying to minimize their losses and stalling for time, the Abasins suddenly surged forward and tried to recover the stolen gate at all costs. Alanik's forces shifted from trying to put pressure on the Abasins to a strictly defensive posture, trying to keep the Abasins away from the retreating gate with equal zeal. The situation only grew more dire soon after that, as Ebasins realized that recovering the gate was a lost cause and started trying to destroy it instead. "Why are they so upset about us taking the gate?" Zack shouted while creating a thick prismatic wall in between the floating gate stabilization frame and the approaching Ebasin war party. He was just in time. The moment the barrier snapped into place, 3 different projectiles slammed into it, a thin blue javelin of force that crackled with some kind of magical energy, an animated serpent made out of green fire and a large white sphere that had smaller red spheres orbiting around it. The wall flickered, cycling through different colors, and for a moment it seemed it would hold, but then the 3 projectiles combined together to release some kind of combined pulse that disrupted the barrier and it fell apart into multicolored smoke. The fire serpent, the only survivor of this clash of spells, surged madly towards the floating gate, seeking to detonate itself against its surface. It never reached it. A milky white sphere soon hit it in the flank, courtesy of Zorian, causing it to fall apart into rapidly fading clusters of green fire. "They're afraid of what Quatakikl will do to them when he finds out they let someone acquire a sample of his work," Zorian said. The simulacrum suspected the original had taken said information straight from the minds of nearby Ebasins. "He doesn't even let his allies examine it. How do you think he would feel about this?" The battle raged on. The simulacrum watched, rather discontent, as people fought all around him to either destroy or preserve the floating gate. He couldn't do much himself, as any significant mana use would cripple the original's ability to fight, so he was reduced to a role of observer for the most part. He watched the battle carefully, scrutinizing every detail in hopes of spotting something that required his attention. The Ebasins charged forward again and again, supported by long-range spells from their allies in the back ranks, only to be repulsed. Zorian's golems slowly dwindled in number, the volume of spell fire too much even for their heavy wards to handle. When they grew too damaged to be of much use, Zorian strapped alchemical bombs all over them and sent them into suicide charges to halt particularly troublesome offensives. Zack's spells reaped a bloody toll on Ebasin forces, but not even his mana reserves were endless and the time he spent in recovery gradually increased as the battle grew more heated. One of the Ebasin mages decided to sacrifice his life for the cause. As he finished casting his last spell, he removed a ritual dagger from his belt and slit his own throat, using some blood magic to pour every shred of his life force into it. The resulting spell produced an incandescent meteor that punched through every single obstacle in front of it, and would have no doubt reduced the floating gate into molten rubble if Svim hadn't used a series of dimensional gates to redirect it back at the Ebasins. Finally, the simulacrum noticed something he felt merited his attention. On the edges of the main battlefield, a small group of friendly soldiers was being overwhelmed. Of the original 15, most were already dead. Only 6 still lived, and only 3 of those 6 could walk and fight properly. The simulacrum telepathically alerted the original to the situation, but was told everyone was currently busy and that sacrifices have to be made in situations like these. The simulacrum then pointed out to him that one of the survivors was Taven. The original immediately changed his mind and told the simulacrum to go and help them. The simulacrum wouldn't have actually obeyed an order to leave Taven to her fate, but it was nice that he and the original were still on the same page in this regard. He teleported next to the group and immediately intercepted an incoming fireball with a well-placed dispelling wave. Taven's shocked face was kind of priceless. "What are you waiting for?" the simulacrum asked the group. One of the Ebasins tried to sneak up on them by kicking up a cloud of dust with a mis-aimed spell and using it as a cover for his approach. He received a force lance to the face for his trouble. "This position is lost. Why haven't you regrouped elsewhere? We can't leave them." Taven protested, pointing at the 3 wounded soldiers next to her. "I told you to leave us here," one of the wounded soldiers said. "Just go. We'll stall them to buy you some time. We're not leaving anyone behind." Taven insisted. The other 2 healthy soldiers said nothing, but the simulacrum could see on their faces that they didn't want to leave the wounded soldiers behind either. They were probably friends. How about this, you go and take these people to safety, and I'll hold the Abasins at bay, the simulacrum offered. Zorian, Taven started, sounding both a little annoyed and a little worried. The simulacrum wasn't listening to her anymore, though. He could feel the Abasins moving towards the group again, so he conjured two large severing discs above his palms and launched them forward in front of him. The first wave of Abasins literally fell apart before the discs, screaming horribly as they were effortlessly sliced apart by the two buzzing spell constructs. The commander of the Abasin group tried to restore order to his unit, shouting orders and threats so loudly the entire base must have heard him. He fell silent when his own bodyguard slammed a knife in his eye socket, killing him instantly. The apparent betrayal, which was actually the result of Zorian puppeteering the man's body, not genuine betrayal, further sowed chaos in the Abasin group, stalling the attack. The simulacrum then shifted his attention back to Taven and her group, only to find the soldiers gone but Taven still present. Let me guess, the simulacrum sighed. You sent the rest of them to safety but decided to stay behind with me. I told you, she said. We're not leaving anyone behind. In retrospect, he really should have made it clear he was a simulacrum right from the start. Listen, he started. I'm actually. Stupid simulacrum. The original's voice thundered in his mind. What the hell are you doing down there? The rest of the soldiers are back but you and Taven aren't. Stop fooling around and spending all our mana, damn it. I need that to defend the gate. The simulacrum winced at the angry tirade in his head. The interruption left him confused for a second, unable to remember what he was doing right before the original contacted him. He was further distracted when another volley of spells erupted towards the two of them, roughly half of it directed at him and the other half at Taven. Taven blocked her share of projectiles easily enough, and the simulacrum was just about to do the same for himself when he felt his mana reserves rapidly drain away. Apparently the original had decided to blow his entire mana reserves on something, leaving them both defenseless for a while. Damn it, original, the simulacrum quietly grumbled. Then the spell volley hit him, tearing straight into him and blowing his ectoplasmic form into rapidly fading pieces. As his tattered remains started to unravel, he spared one last look at Taven, who was looking at him with an absolutely horrified look on her face. Only then did he remember what he had been trying to tell her before the original contacted him. His last fading thought was that he really should have made it clear that he was just a simulacrum right from the start. In the end, they managed to extract the gate stabilization frame out of the Abasin base safe and intact. The frenzied attempts of the Abasin forces to stop them had petered out after a while, the surviving soldiers retreating back to their base and allowing them to withdraw in peace. The forces assembled. Bionic and Zorian had paid a heavy price for this success, however, being cut nearly in half by the end. Only time would tell if the researchers Svim gathered would find out anything useful about the recovered gate stabilization frame. As they suspected, Quadakikal showed up not long after they finished their retreat, having received a call for help at some point in the fight. Zack and Zorian had been on edge for a few days after this, expecting the Abasins to launch a premature invasion of Scioria, much like they had in that one restart where Zorian prodded Eldamar into attacking Ayaska Mansion, but what happened instead is that the remaining Abasins started to withdraw from Scioria entirely. The invasion, it seemed, was being cancelled. After the attack on the Abasin base had been concluded and it became obvious that no immediate invasion would result from it, Zorian proceeded to re-establish his link to Koth. Since he had dismissed his simulacrum in Koth before the attack, he had to rely on Damon's help for the second time in the restart. Although it kinda bothered him that he was forced to rely on Daimon so much, he had to admit his help made things a lot easier than they would have otherwise been. He didn't expect any problems to crop up and, in a way, there really hadn't been any. The dimensional gate opened just fine, after all. The problem was that it opened directly inside the Terramachula estate. Instead of finding some out-of-the-way location in the jungle, like they had agreed on beforehand, Daimon had decided to simply open the gate inside a heavily warded room meant for receiving teleporting visitors. while a dozen or so Pteromatula family members stood around the edges of the room and watched. Zorian, who had stepped through the gate first, was so shocked at the sight that he immediately halted in his tracks. This caused Zack, who was coming right behind him, to crash into him. Thankfully, they managed to keep their balance instead of falling to the floor in a tangle of limbs. That would have been awkward. "Hey, why did you stoo? That's a lot bigger reception than I was expecting," Zack said, looking around. Zorian didn't bother responding to Zack's feeble attempt at humor. Instead, he zeroed in on his older brother and gave him an outraged glare. "Daimen, what the hell were you thinking?" To his credit, Daimen actually winced at the question, looking properly guilty. "I'm sorry," he said, waving his hands in front of him in a placating gesture. "I didn't have a choice, okay? I can't leave the Pteromatula estate anymore, and I couldn't just open a dimensional gate in their home without their knowledge or consent. It was either this or aborting the whole thing entirely." Zack and Zorian were quiet for a second, processing that statement. "Why can't you leave the Pteromatula estate?" Zack finally asked. "Are you a prisoner or something?" "It's complicated," Daimen said with a heavy sigh. "Let's go find somewhere quiet to talk." Before either Zack or Zorian could say anything, one of the gathered Pteromatula decided to cut in and make a suggestion. It was Alana, the woman who had greeted them the first time they had visited the estate. "I know just the place," Alana said. "For a family of our stature, not having an appropriate meeting room for occasions such as these would be quite an embarrassment. Please wait a minute while I make some arrangements and then we can go." Zorian gave Alana a thoughtful look. Though her words made it seem she was just trying to be a good host, he could understand the underlying message easily enough. The Pteromatula were an involved party in all this, and they wanted to be present during the talk. Alana raised an eyebrow at his look, as if daring him to object. He didn't. "That's quite all right," he simply said. "Me and Zack will go collapse the gate while you deal with things on your end." Zorian had no idea what Daimen had told the Pteromatula about the gate. Hopefully he hadn't been foolish enough to reveal that he and Zorian were opening passages between two different continents, in which case it was imperative that they close the gate quickly, before they could puzzle out the truth for themselves. As he and Zack worked to collapse the gate, he could hear Alana conversing with some of the other Pteromatula in the room. His grasp on the local language was still very poor, so the only thing he understood was that she ordered food and drink to be made and brought to them. Zorian was in no mood for either, but he figured out it would be impolite to try and stop her. A little while later, they were all ushered into a relatively small but luxurious room. There were 5 of them present: Alana, Daimen, Orissa, Zack and Zorian. Despite the presence of Alana and Orissa, though, it was Daimen that provided most of the explanation for what was happening. Apparently, one or more members of Damon's team had talked to outsiders about the orb they had found, and the story had blown up very quickly. Within hours, everyone and their mother wanted to speak to Daimen to find out what he intended to do with the orb and to try and influence him to sell it to whatever group they represented. Caught off guard by the sudden flood of interested buyers and aware that not everyone was willing to take their refusal to sell the orb in good grace, Daimen and his team retreated to the Pteromatula estate and barricaded themselves there until further notice. "The people after us can't afford to be too brazen with the Pteromatula, so we're safe while we remain inside the estate," Daimen concluded. "But the moment we step out we'll be ambushed by dozens of different groups. They know we're in here. They have the estate heavily monitored. Everyone and everything going in or out of the estate is closely tracked. I couldn't possibly leave the estate to open the gate elsewhere. Maybe I'm just stupid, but why don't the Pteromatula simply tell all these people to back off? They're supposed to be the main political force here, no?" Zack asked. "I'm afraid it's not that simple," Alana said. "There are too many powerful groups making their moves here, quite a few of them from outside our sphere of influence. Though they cannot afford to take us lightly, the same is true for us as well. This is a sensitive situation and we have to move carefully. Rest assured, though, that we are taking note of every slight against us for when the time is right. Another issue is that some elements of the local government are discussing the possibility of simply confiscating the orb from us by force, Diamond said. The Terramacula have to spend a lot of their influence on making sure that the initiative doesn't get anywhere. Damn it, I knew it was important to keep this find a secret, but I had no idea it would inspire this sort of greed. It's a portable pocket dimension of massive size, Orissa pointed out. On top of that, it contains ruins from the Age of Gods, and probably the remains of Awantemti's wealth. There could be divine artifacts in there, plants and animals that have gone extinct in the rest of the world, anything. Of course it inspires so much greed. You're fortunate you have the Terramacula family to shield you from all this while we figure out what to do. Yes, I get it, Diamond said patiently. I'm lucky to have you, dear. Have you made any trips to the pocket dimension yet? Zack asked curiously. We haven't even discovered how to deploy the orb, Diamond said, shaking his head. We don't have a command marker like Zorian does, so we have to do things the hard way. Meaning? Zack prodded for details. We have to reverse engineer the control spells that are used for operating the orb, Diamond said. A generational treasure like this one would definitely have a method of controlling the orb without a command marker, as a safety measure if nothing else. We just have to find it. Unfortunately, that could take a while. Diamond gave Zorian a meaningful look. Though Zorian didn't know for sure what he was trying to tell him, he could guess. While finding a way to operate the orb without a marker was not a priority for him and Zack, it would mean a lot for Diamond. He was probably well aware that Zorian had no intention whatsoever of revealing his abilities to Diamond outside the time loop, which would make those control spells absolutely crucial to his mission. Without them, even removing the orb from its resting place would be impossible, greatly complicating everything. Even if we had the means of operating the orb, we would still refrain from sending an expedition to its interior at this time, Orissa noted. The possibility of further guardian beasts, like that god-touched Hydra, is too high. Months of preparation would be required to mount a proper expedition, and the current political situation makes such preparations impossible. Yes, exactly, Diamond quickly agreed. He turned to Zack and Zorian. And because I'm stuck here all the time, I can't really hire the experts I need to figure out how to operate the orb either. The truth is that I have very little to do here. I was thinking it might be a good idea for me to disappear for a few days. Get the orb away from covetous eyes and talk to some old friends about my options. This again, Orissa said with an unhappy frown. This sparked a brief argument between Orissa and Diamond, since Diamond didn't want to explain what exactly he was up to and Orissa insisted that she had every right to know the details. In all honesty, Zorian thought Orissa's position was quite reasonable and empathized with her frustration at Damon's evasiveness. However, he also couldn't fault Diamond for this, since it wasn't like he could just openly say that. If you want us to take you back to Scioria with us when we reopen the gate, you should just say so, Zack said. Everyone sent him a shocked look. Well, everyone except Zorian. He just buried his face in his hands and tried to take deep breaths. Damn it, Zack, he mumbled into his hands. What? Zack protested, giving Zorian an exasperated look. Any story you and Diamond cook up wouldn't last a day and you know it. They're not stupid. They'd figure it out soon enough. Thank you, Mr. Novita, Bolana told him. I'm glad that at least one man here respects our reasoning skills. Zack gave her a thumbs up and a sunny grin. You're saying you opened a dimensional passage here all the way from Eldamar? Orissa asked, sounding just a little bit incredulous. We do a lot of crazy stuff, Zack said with a careless shrug. It turned out that neither Alana nor Orissa were very familiar with the details of how the gate spell works. This wasn't very surprising, as the spell was extremely rare, but somehow Zorian kept forgetting little details like that. After Zorian gave them a brief explanation of how the gate spell functioned, Orissa gave him a strange look. What? Zorian asked, feeling somewhat self-conscious. This method you use to ignore distance limitations requires another person helping you on the other side, yes? She asked. Zorian nodded wordlessly. Then how can you open a gate back to Eldamar? Can the third Kaczynski brother cast the gate spell, too? What, Fortov? Please, Zorian scoffed. He'll be lucky not to flunk out of the academy. Zorian. Daimen protested. He never liked it when Zorian badmouthed the rest of the family. No, we'll be using the simulacrum I left back in Scioria, Zorian said, completely ignoring Daimen's outburst. Since I can cast the gate spell, my simulacrum can obviously do the same. Oh, so you can create a simulacrum too? Olana asked casually, not sounding particularly surprised. Zorian had to hand it to her, she was very good at projecting an aura of serene confidence. Orisa seemed to be trying to mimic that attitude, but she was nowhere near good enough to pull it off. One could see that these kind of reveals bothered her and put her somewhat off balance. We do a lot of crazy stuff, Zorian said. He thought about mimicking Zack completely and giving her a thumbs up and a cheeky smile, but quickly dropped the idea. That sort of thing was something only Zack could pull off without looking like a total idiot. In the end, they managed to hammer out an agreement. Daimen would return to Scioria with Zack and Zorian and would take the orb of the first emperor along with him. Zorian would leave a simulacrum in the Terramachula estate so that they could return via gate spell in exactly 4 days. Zorian thought this would be the end of it, but his hopes were ruthlessly squashed when Daimen told him he still had to explain to his team that he would be away for a while. For a moment, Zorian felt the urge to make an overdramatic gesture to the uncaring heavens. And here he'd thought this would just be a short visit to Koth, consisting of little more than replacing his lost simulacrum and asking Daimen if he had found out anything new about the orb. Sometimes he just couldn't win. It was a massive relief to Zorian when the three of them finally stepped through the gate and returned to Scioria. Both the Terramachula and Daimen's team were on edge right now, and thus rather exasperating to deal with. He kind of felt bad for his simulacrum, who would be stuck with them for the next several days. Oh well, at least he had Kerma and Torin to talk to. Those two were fairly interesting and he suspected he might be able to broker some kind of trade with at least one of them. Regardless, he was back and could devote himself to other matters. Svim's efforts to convince various experts to trade their secrets with him had been reasonably successful. Sudamir had to be properly interrogated. The efforts of the researchers to understand the Abasin Gate stabilization frame were starting to bear fruit, and the Silent Doorway adepts were hinting that they were willing to send a group over to Koth to acquire a gate key. Sadly, recent events concerning Daimen and the orb had probably made that last idea a dead end in this restart. His simulacrum couldn't possibly leave the Terramachula estate without 100 pairs of eyes following his every move. Unfortunate. He could really use an alternate entrance to Koth that didn't rely on Daimen right now. He would have to assign a high priority to this idea in future restarts. Daimen had agreed to hand over the orb to him and Zack while he was in Scioria. Partially because he figured they could find out far more about it than he could, due to possessing a marker that could actually operate it, and partially because he wasn't entirely sure the orb would be safe in his possession. News traveled faster than people. By all rights, his little trip to Scioria should have gone undetected by his pursuers, but he couldn't be completely sure. Thus, he felt it was for the best if he didn't have the orb on him unless absolutely necessary. Zorian expected that he would be the only one that could tinker with the orb to discover its secrets, since Zack didn't have the necessary personal soul awareness to control his marker. He was very much wrong. Apparently, Zack didn't need to have conscious control over his marker to take command of the orb. After an hour or so of tinkering with the orb, Zack managed to connect to it instinctively. And after that one success, he no longer needed an hour of tinkering to connect to again. Simply touching the orb would be enough to re-establish contact. Zack didn't even have to concentrate on it to pull it off. A touch and a stray thought were enough. Zorian was a little sour about that. The orb certainly never reacted that way to him, no matter how many hours he spent interacting with it. No, he had to spend months going through that hellish soul awareness training and then more time painstakingly studying the way the marker worked to get as far as he did. This sort of stuff really made it obvious that his marker was some kind of inferior version of the one on Zack. It had been only a day since they were back in Syoria when Daimen surprised him again. He wanted to talk to Curiel and Fortov. This was a bit of a problem. Both of their siblings knew for a fact that Daimen shouldn't be in Syoria. Mother and father had gone to Koth to meet with him. How on earth did he intend to explain his presence here? But Daimen insisted that he needed to do this, and Zorian didn't feel like arguing with him. There was probably no great harm in it, and he was pretty sure that Daimen would go and have those conversations behind his back if he was too stubborn. Amusingly, Daimen wanted to talk to Curiel and Fortov alone, without anyone else being present. Zorian was almost certain that meant he wanted to ask them specifically about Zorian. Ha! Fortov didn't know anything about Zorian, and Curiel was a little tattletale and would no doubt tell Zorian everything that she and Daimen talked about. But he told Daimen none of that and simply wished him luck before sending him on his way. The next day, Daimen came back to talk to him, looking lost and confused. "They didn't even want to talk to me," he complained, sounding quite dejected. It actually made Zorian feel bad for him somewhat. "Come on, it's not that bad," Zorian comforted him. "I don't know about Fortov, but I'm pretty sure Curiel wouldn't have snubbed you like that. Imaya tells me you spent an entire hour with her." "Yeah, but that's all I did with her," Daimen complained. "She spent the entire hour fidgeting and looking uncomfortable. She barely spoke, and only when I specifically prodded her. I'm not entirely sure, but I think she was actually a little scared of me." "That's..." Damien waved his hands in the air, as if trying to convey some kind of unpronounceable concept through silent gesticulation. "Sad?" Zorian offered. "Sure, let's go with that," Daimen said. "Also worrying. And upsetting. And a whole host of other things. Especially when coupled with what happened with Fortov. Do you know what happened when I knocked on his door?" "Not really, no," Zorian told him. He had actually known about Damon's talk with Curiel, since she had told him all about it when he had come to Amaya's place in the evening, but he honestly had no idea how Damon's talk with Fortov had gone. Not well, obviously, but it would be interesting to hear why. "What did he do?" "He was just really abrasive to me right from the start," Daimen said. "He refused to even let me in, eventually started shouting at me and then slammed the door in my face and ignored me." "Huh. Interesting." Daimen looked at Zorian, silently asking him for an explanation. Zorian said nothing, though, and Daimen grew visibly frustrated as seconds ticked by. He ran both of his hands through his hair and clutched it tightly in his fists, as if wanting to tear it off. "You're going to go prematurely bald if you keep doing that," Zorian commented lightly. Daimen gave him an unamused glare. But he did remove his hands from his head. "I don't understand." Daimen protested loudly. Am I such a horrible older brother? I knew you didn't like me, but even Fortov? Even little Curiel? Why? What did I do?" Zorian clacked his tongue and considered things for a second. On one hand, he felt that Daimen was getting exactly what he deserved. On the other hand, the fact that Daimen was so upset over this meant that his mental image of him was a little unfair. He decided to be a little nice to his older brother for a change. "In regards to Curiel, the answer is simple, my dear eldest brother," Zorian told him. "You're practically a stranger to her. By the time she was old enough to interact with people, you were almost never at home. When was the last time you talked with her? Disregarding yesterday's meeting, of course." Daimen fumbled. "You can't even remember," Zorian stated, shaking his head. "Anyway, all she had of you were stories she heard of you. Most of which came either from mother or from me. After all, I'm one of the people who interacted with her the most over the years. Oh, heavens help me, Daimen lamented. What exactly did you tell her about me? The truth, Zorian shrugged. You mean your truth, Daimen accused. Of course, Zorian responded, completely unmoved by the accusation. But don't worry, I kept quiet about your worst excesses. Truth be told, I never liked talking about you to anyone, and that included Kiriel. And besides, Mother never failed to take your side in everything. If it were just the matter of stories, Kiriel would be more ambivalent to you. The thing is, she needs help and she knows she'll never get it from you. She just might get it from me, though, which is why she doesn't want to sabotage her relations with me by getting cozy with you. She knows you kind of piss me off. What do you mean, she needs help? Daimen frowned. And why are you so sure she'd never get it from me? Because it would require standing up to Mother, Zorian said. Over the next hour or so, Zorian tried to familiarize Daimen with Kiriel's situation. The arranged marriage their parents had prepared for her. Her desire to learn magic like the rest of them. He tried to keep the explanations brief, worried that telling this to Daimen constituted some kind of betrayal towards Kiriel, who had told him these things in confidence. He said enough for Daimen to form a rudimentary picture of what was happening with Kiriel behind the scenes, though. I can't believe I never heard of this, Daimen said, his eyes somewhat unfocused as he seemed to recall something in his head. I speak to Mother and Father often and they never mention this. Did you ever actually ask them about Kiriel? Zorian asked. Daimen was quiet for a few moments. No, he eventually admitted. Well, there you go, Zorian shrugged. Daimen exhaled heavily and then corrected his posture, sitting a little straighter in his chair. Okay, I admit I haven't been very fair to our little sister. I guess I kind of deserved such a chilly reception from her, Daimen said. What about Fortov, then? What's his deal? How would I know? Zorian protested. Do you honestly think I speak to Fortov about you? Daimen gave him an annoyed huff. Yes, I get it you never talk about me to anyone if you can help it. But surely you have some inkling about how Fortov thinks and what bothers him. You've been interacting with him for 6 years now. Zorian made a weird face, momentarily struck speechless by this statement. What? Zorian laughed. Whatever gave you that idea? Why would I be interacting with Fortov? Are you serious? Daimen asked incredulously. Zorian stared at him. He's your brother. You live in the same city. You can visit him anytime you want. So? Zorian asked, inclining his head uncomprehendingly. Are you honestly telling me that in all these years, you haven't seriously talked to our brother even once? Daimen asked. His tone was pleading, as if begging Zorian to tell him he's wrong. That's what I'm saying, yes, Zorian nodded. Why would Daimen expect anything else from him? Doesn't the restart end in a massive invasion? Daimen frowned. Zorian nodded again. What does Fortov do during the invasion? Presumably he reaches the academy shelters and spends the night there, along with the other students, Zorian shrugged. Admittedly, the shelters hadn't been very safe during the one occasion he had actually experienced them, but that was when Red Robe had actively been helping the invaders by feeding them information. Without his help, the shelters were actually pretty safe. Presumably. You never checked? Daimen asked. Zorian shook his head in denial. Zorian, for heaven's sake. I don't see why you're so surprised by this, Zorian told him honestly. Fortov is my second least favorite person in the whole family, right after father. Of course I never bothered to check up on him. Daimen opened his mouth, as if he wanted to continue that argument, but then just shook his head and gave up. Never mind, Daimen sighed. Did you have any interactions with him during all this time? Actually, yes, Zorian said. He pushes this one girl into a purple creeper patch near the end of every restart and then comes to me to beg for a healing salve. I used to just avoid being home whenever he comes, but these days it's not even necessary. He never comes to find me if I stay at Amaya's place. He pushes this girl into a purple creeper patch regardless of what you change in a restart. Diamond said, frowning. As far as I can tell, yes, Zorian confirmed. The girl has a huge crush on him, if that means anything to you. Diamond made a thoughtful hum. It's better than nothing, I guess. But really, Zorian, must you be so petty and callous? I know you and Fortov didn't get along as kids, but this sort of attitude is a little too much. You nurse your grudges way too deeply. It's easy for you to call for peace and understanding, Zorian said, folding his arms over his chest defiantly. It's not you who had to deal with Fortov's crappy attitude over the years. All I'm saying is that maybe you should give him a chance, Diamond said. Like you did with Kiriel when you decided to take her with you to Syoria. If you were wrong about her, who's to say you weren't wrong about Fortov as well? But I wasn't really wrong about her, Zorian pointed out. I didn't want her around because I felt she was a selfish little blabbermouth that would distract me from my studies and tattle on me when she returns to Mother. That's all still true, it's just that I no longer care about that. Provided I actually manage to find a way out of this time loop, my future is set. I can afford a distraction or two, and Kiriel running off and revealing my plans and activities to Mother is irrelevant because our parents can't stop me anymore. I'm so skilled and powerful that I can do whatever I want, Mother and Father be damned. Somewhat surprisingly, Diamond didn't grow even more frustrated at this response, like Zorian thought he would. Instead he just gave him a sad smile and shook his head ruefully. Mother and Father are so concerned about me making a mistake that they're rushing over to Koth even as we speak to talk me out of my marriage to Orissa, but they fail to notice a crisis developing right in front of them, he said. We really are one messed up family, aren't we? And the terrifying thing in all this is that I will forget all about this very soon, won't I? After the summer festival, it will be as if none of this ever happened. That's so unfair. How the hell can I fix a problem if I have no memory of its existence? I don't think you could fix our family, even if you had all the time in the world, Zorian told him. But yes, the reality of the time loop is rather soul-crushing if one really thinks about it. You're dealing with this pretty well, all things considered. It's mostly because I have avoided thinking about it too deeply, I think, Diamond said. Now that we're getting closer to the time limit, I find my thoughts wandering towards it more and more. Especially since I've done so much in these last few weeks. I've realized so many things. Important things. It's frightening and infuriating to realize I must lose it all. Well, I'm sure you've heard about the notebooks I'm transferring between restarts for various people, Zorian noted. If it's really so important, you can just write it down and hand it to me for safekeeping. Oh. Diamond smiled. So I actually qualify for that prestigious service? I must say, the way you've been talking about our family, I was starting to get a little worried. What if you intended to just forget about me in all future restarts? You already know how to find the orb, after all, and I know you aren't exactly a big fan of me. Zorian gave him a mildly uncomfortable look. He had been thinking of something like that. Though his eldest brother would surely be useful in tracking down and recovering the rest of the pieces of the key, it bothered Zorian a great deal to rely on Diamond for anything. It just felt wrong. Convincing Diamond to help them was a time-consuming task, too, so was it really worth the time to include him in their efforts? In the end he realized he was just looking for excuses. They needed the help that Diamond could provide. If nothing else, it wasn't very fair to Zack to sabotage their chances of getting out of the time loop just because he had a problem with Diamond. Plus, the truth was. I was wrong about you, okay? Zorian said with a heavy sigh. I still think you're very annoying, but you're not as bad as the Diamond that lived inside my head. It hurt him to say it, but it was the truth. Maybe Diamond had changed after he had moved out of the house and stopped interacting with Zorian, or maybe Zorian's image of him had never been all that reliable to begin with. Whatever the truth, this Diamond was more helpful and reasonable than the dark giant that had loomed over him in the past. I'm not sure if I'd call it wrong, exactly. Regardless of their reasons, the other two siblings don't like me much either. I'm clearly an abject failure as an older brother. It's a sobering realization, Diamond mused. After a second of silence, he shook his head as if to clear it up. But enough of depressing topics like that. You mentioned the notebooks you're carrying across restarts for Svim and the others. As it happens, I've taken the time to talk with Svim yesterday. He told me about the trade deals you two are trying to set up with various experts. Yes, it's honestly one of my better ideas, Zorian nodded. It's already showing results and there is every indication we can do even better in future restarts. I don't think every single one of those experts will agree to a trade in the end, but quite a few are clearly open to the idea if approached by someone they actually respect. Are you thinking of helping Svim convince people? No, Diamond shook his head. I'll be pleased to help if Svim asks for it, but my involvement could easily turn the initiative into an unmitigated disaster. You probably think of my fame as purely beneficial, but the truth is it causes many mages to view me as a threat. A lot of them would never trade anything with me. Why do you think I never learned how to cast the gate spell before you came along? I see, Zorian said thoughtfully. If not that, though, why did you mention Svim's efforts? Well, began Diamond. Gathering secret knowledge from Altasia's many experts is a commendable initiative, but it is hard work and it will likely only provide incremental improvement to your capabilities. True, Zorian said. But what's the alternative? All the low-hanging fruit has already been plucked. Not necessarily, Diamond said with a grin. What is and is not low-hanging fruit depends on a person's abilities, and you have something that few other people do, an ability to traverse between continents with ease. Zorian thought about it for a second and then motioned for Diamond to continue. He didn't quite see what he was getting at. What I'm saying is that Koth would be a good place to extend your magic gathering initiative, Diamond continued. Unlike Zlotic, which is relatively well connected to Altazia due to the existence of the teleport network, Koth is quite remote. Despite that, they use the same basic magic system that we do, unlike San. This makes them a great place to find unexpected spell combinations and novel alchemy. Who knows what kind of low-hanging fruit can be obtained by combining our magical traditions with those of Koth? Zorian raised his eyebrow at his eldest brother. Diamond looked quite animated as he spoke of the idea. And I suppose you're volunteering to run this sort of initiative? Zorian asked. Haha, Diamond laughed nervously. To be perfectly honest, doing this was one of my objectives in coming to Koth. I was in the process of laying the groundwork for it even before the time loop started. Well, that's great then, Zorian told him honestly. I don't see an issue with the idea, then. Great. Diamond said, giving him a sunny smile reminiscent of Zack. It's just that this time loop came too soon and not all of the preparations were complete. I may need a tiny loan from my dearest brother to start things up. A few days later, Diamond was returned to Koth. The orb was left in Scioria, since Diamond figured it was safer that way and because Zack had really taken a liking to it. Busy as he was with other things, Zorian decided to delegate all orb-related tinkering to Zack. Considering how much more strongly the orb reacted to him, Zack may be in a better position to uncover its secrets anyway. Today, though, Zorian had received a somewhat unusual request. Taven wanted to talk to him. In private. Normally such a request wouldn't be particularly notable, but Zorian had actually not seen or heard from Taven at all since their attack on the Abasan base. If it were not for Alanik's assurances that she had survived the battle in perfect health, Zorian would have been honestly worried for her. As it was obvious she had been avoiding him for some reason. He had actually thought about tracking her down to ask what was happening, but the end of the restart was approaching and so many things were vying for his time and attention. No matter. Since she'd reached out to him all of a sudden, he would presumably find out what was bothering her quite soon. When they met he offered to teleport them to some empty, quiet place, but she would have none of that. Apparently when she said she wanted to talk in private, she meant she would bring him to her family training hall, the same one where they sometimes sparred against one another in previous restarts. She seemed to find the place calming and reassuring. "So what's this about?" he asked her. "I'm worried," she said. She sounded worried, too. Zorian waited for a few seconds for a clarification of what exactly she was worried about, but Taven seemed to have trouble finding the words. She paced around the training hall like a caged tiger, scowling and shaking her head. "No, seriously, what is this about?" Zorian asked. She still didn't say anything. "Is it time loop related?" he added after a bit of thought. "Of course it's time loop related," she burst out at him. She looked like she was going to snap at him but quickly managed to rein herself in. She shook her head sadly. "And, in a way, it isn't. I don't even know why I called you here. It's stupid. I should just. Don't even dare try to send me away now," Zorian warned her. I won't," she assured him. I just realized I probably lost you as a friend." Zorian gave her an incredulous look. "And why would you think that?" Zorian asked her curiously. "Because this time loop has changed you," she told him. "You already feel like a stranger to me. You're so hard to read these days, and so very capable. Everything I can do, you can do better. And that's only going to get worse as you spend time in here. By the time you get out, why would you need me anymore? By the time this is all resolved, I will probably no longer have a friend." You're being overdramatic," Zorian told her. He knew he was probably sounding a little dismissive, but he honestly didn't know what else to tell her. "I know you don't remember this, but I spend a lot of time interacting with you in various restarts. There is zero chance that I'm just going to forget you." "Well, yes, I'm sure that you won't just forget me," she huffed. "But any concern you have for me will be of the patronizing kind. You'll be so above me it isn't even funny. We won't be equals, you know. It'll be you, a secret archmage, keeping an eye on his old friend for old time's sake. It's very depressing." "Ah," said Zorian slowly. There was a lot of truth in what she was saying. There was really no way their friendship would be the same as it had been before the time loop. However, that was not necessarily a bad thing. His past self was somewhat bitter with Taven. He had not considered them to be close friends, something that Taven seemed rather oblivious to. Much like she was oblivious to his past crush on her, really. So yes, their relationship would never be the same. But was that a bad thing? While Taven might lament the loss of their earlier friendship, Zorian couldn't help but wonder whether there would have even been a friendship if he hadn't got stuck in this time loop. Would he have eventually overcome the hurt of having his love confession laughed at and re-established close bonds with her? Probably. But it would have taken quite some time and he wasn't sure Taven would have stuck around him for long enough to see that happen. "Why did you ever decide to become friends with me, anyway?" Zorian asked her curiously. "This will sound a little self-deprecating, but I don't think I was that good of a friend." Haha, she laughed, her mood brightening a little. "Well, it's good that you're so honest. That's the one change I like about the new you." She picked up a practice doll from a nearby bench and started making minute corrections to it. Zorian couldn't see what they were meant to do, so he assumed she was just stalling for time and giving herself something to do. "Since you are willing to be a little self-deprecating, I will follow your example," Taven eventually said. "I wasn't a very good friend either. Either to you or to anyone else. I'm too blunt and impulsive and I can't judge the situation and people very well. Most people actually find me pretty insulting and aggravating. I actually have very few friends aside from you," she continued. "Aside from you, only my two teammates seem to like me. But Yurik and Oren, they're old friends. I'll never be anything other than the third wheel if I hang out around them. But I didn't have any other friends, Zorian surmised. Yeah, Taven told him. You annoyed me, I annoyed you, but we got along with each other anyway. Maybe you weren't a good friend, but I wasn't much better, so it didn't matter. But now you're getting better, and I can't. She hugged the practice doll like a little girl trying to comfort herself with a favorite toy. It was a somewhat weird sight, since the practice doll was the size of an adult human and creepily featureless. Zorian stared at her, wondering how to handle this. He didn't see how he could convince Taven that the nature of their friendship wouldn't change once he got out of the time loop. It would be an obvious lie. Of course, Zorian did not consider this change to be a bad thing, but to explain why he felt that way he would have to. Why not? If he was really honest with himself, he always had wanted to do this. He just hadn't had the courage to go through with it. I had a crush on you once, he told her. She exclaimed, jerking in surprise and dropping the practice doll. It clattered to the floor, leaving deafening silence in its wake. For a moment, anyway. What do you mean, you had a crush on me? When? How? Do you remember that time I asked you out on a date? He asked her. What? Are we talking about that time? She fumbled. Zorian nodded anyway. He had only ever asked her to a date once in the time they knew each other, so she couldn't be thinking of anything else. But, isn't that when I laughed at you? Zorian gave her a long-suffering look. Yes, he confirmed. Yes, it is. It wasn't a joke, Taven. I was dead serious about it. Ah ha ha, she laughed nervously. Wow, that's really something. She buried her face into her hands for a moment. Gods above, I'm so stupid sometimes, she mumbled into her hands. Then she punched him in the shoulder. Hey, he protested in mild outrage. He'd normally be more bothered about the sudden physical violence, but it was Taven. He expected that sort of thing from her. What the hell? And you're stupid too, she told him. Why the hell would you just accept me laughing at you like that if you were being serious? Well, what the hell was I supposed to do? Zorian protested. Tell me I was wrong. Ask me out again. Get angry before storming off. Taven shouted. Anything. Not just pretend everything was fine and retreat with a tail between your legs like a wounded puppy. I mean, I kept joking about that long afterwards and you still didn't say anything. At least if I knew I wouldn't have been rubbing salt into your wounds like that. It doesn't matter, Zorian grunted. In the end I still got an answer to my question. You clearly weren't interested in me that way. You found the very idea laughable, even. Oh come on, she whined. That's not fair. I wasn't laughing because the idea of me dating you was so ridiculous. I was laughing because I gave you love advice urging you to ask people out and you followed it by immediately asking me out. It just seemed to me like you were making a joke. In retrospect, I was being stupid, but you should have said something, damn it. There was a long, uncomfortable silence as the two of them refused to look at each other and sat there in silence. We're going out on a date, Taven suddenly declared. Zorian gave her a weird look. But I'm over you, he pointed out. That's why I said I had a crush on you. It's all in the past for me. Yeah, I figured, she said. It doesn't matter. We're still having a date. Don't I get any say in this? Zorian asked, an amused smile on his face. What are you talking about? Taven sniffed disdainfully. You're the one who asked me to a date. I'm just accepting your invitation with a bit of a delay. Zorian laughed at the uniquely Taven logic. A bit of a delay, she says you really are something, he said, shaking his head. Fine. Have it your way. Good, she said simply, then looked away, as if too shy to meet his eyes. Zorian smiled. He had been telling the truth, and he really didn't have a crush for her any longer. Any romantic feeling he'd had for her had petered out during his long stay in the time loop. But he'd be lying if he said he wasn't kind of glad about this. He never really realized how beautiful Saoria could be in the evening. That was Zorian's thought as he and Taven wandered around Saoria, checking up street stands and discussing casual topics. Most settlements grew dark and quiet as evening approached, giving off a dangerous and sinister atmosphere, but Saoria was a major metropolis and this was the week before the summer festival. The streets were lively and well illuminated, with lots of people wandering around and lots of street vendors setting up stands and trying to convince these people to part with their money for sweets, trinkets, and so on. Zorian would never have guessed that he would enjoy this kind of atmosphere. In the past, he had found occasions like this to be rather aggravating and avoided them whenever possible. Of course, in the past, Zorian would get headaches just from being in a crowd and he didn't have a pretty girl to keep him company. He gave a sideways glance to Taven, who was walking beside him. Even though this was just a friendly date and not anything romantic, he couldn't help but treat it fairly seriously. He had chosen to wear a fairly formal outfit for the evening, took her to an expensive restaurant and even invited her for a round of dance. He was initially worried he was taking things too far, but considering Taven came to the date wearing a very expensive-looking dress and had kept her usual cheery disposition throughout the entire evening, he seemed to have made a good choice. "I've got to say, this went a lot better than I thought it would," Taven suddenly said. Zorian raised an eyebrow at her. "Wait, that came out kind of wrong. What I mean is considering how bad both of us are at the social side of things. Zorian gave her a faint smile and decided to save her from further awkwardness. "It's fine," he said. "I get your point. I'm also pleasantly surprised at how well this turned out. I guess we're better at this than we thought." "Well, in my case it's mostly trial and error, so I can't feel too proud about myself," Taven laughed lightly. "I went to quite a few dates in the past. Plenty of guys get attracted to me for my looks and don't quite comprehend what they're getting into until they experience it firsthand. Trust me, my first date was a real disaster." "Oh. You'll have to tell me that story sometime," Zorian teased. "No way," she said, giving him a playful shove and causing him to stumble to the side a little. He nearly crashed into an elderly couple walking past them, but managed to correct himself in time. The less people know that story, the better. Hell, sometimes I wish I could forget that memory myself. But then I'd probably make the same mistakes all over again, so I guess it's a good thing I can't forget." She frowned suddenly, staring at the night sky for a moment before giving him a curious look. "What?" he prodded. "What about you? Do you do this often?" she asked him. "Do what often?" "Go on a date with you?" Zorian asked, amused. "Well, not with me," she said, rolling her eyes. "I mean in general. You've been in this time loop for years. Surely you've gone on a few dates in all that time." "A few," Zorian admitted. "Ha," she said, pointing her finger at him triumphantly. "I knew it." Zorian opened his mouth to respond but Taven immediately stopped him. "Don't you try and bewitch me with your honeyed words," she said in mock outrage. "I bet you tell them to every girl you pursue." "But I haven't even said anything yet," Zorian pointed out. "Really, I have no intention of justifying myself to you. Based on what you just told me about your dating experiences, you went to a lot more dates than I have. You heartbreaker." They kept talking and meandering through the streets for a while longer, until eventually the conversation wound down and they both seemed to reach an unspoken agreement that it was getting late and that it was time for the date to end. Zorian couldn't help but get progressively quieter and more contemplative as the date grew to a close. They had been walking in silence for several minutes when Taven decided to speak up again. "What's wrong?" Taven asked. "Why did you get so depressed all of a sudden? Was it something I said?" Zorian said, broken out of his reverie. No. It's not you. I'm just thinking. It's probably for the best if I don't tell you. Zorian, don't make me hit you, she said warningly. Fine, if you insist, Zorian said, giving her an awkward chuckle. I was just thinking how utterly depressing it is that you will not remember anything that happened tonight in future restarts. We cleared the air between us, enjoyed a wonderful evening, and none of that will matter when the loop resets again. You will revert to the same suspicious, borderline hostile Taven that I get at the start of every restart. It takes half of each restart just to convince you the time loop is real and that I haven't been lying to you since I met you or been replaced by an imposter, never mind anything else. Taven winced, looking away guiltily. No, don't feel guilty, Zorian told her, shaking his head. It's a perfectly reasonable reaction. It's one thing for old, experienced mages like Svim, Alanik and Daimen to believe in the time loop. They've dealt with many complicated situations in their life and experienced plenty of strange magic. People like you and me. Well, did you know I spent the first 6 restarts going to classes like everything was just fine, hoping everything would return to normal if I just kept my head down and behaved like usual? Taven gave him a surprised look. Yes, I know, Zorian nodded. It's kind of stupid, but that's what I did. Your reaction is pretty good, all things considered. It's just that I really like how this turned out, and yet I realize this will probably forever remain an empty memory in my head. I can't replicate the chain of events that led to this in the real world. I'm not even sure I can replicate it in future restarts. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out what I should do about this in the future. A short, awkward silence descended on the scene, causing Zorian to wince a little inside at his own poor timing. Why did he insist on telling her this now? He just couldn't let things end on a positive note, could he? Sorry, he said quietly. He suddenly felt like he could understand some of Zack's attitude towards people around them. Was this why Zack no longer bothered to actively befriend any of their classmates or friendly strangers, even though he clearly used to do so extensively in the past? The way Zorian was feeling this evening, perhaps this was how Zack felt all the time during his earlier years. Making friends and experiencing life-changing moments with them over and over again, only for the other party to forget all about it in the next restart. Don't be sorry, Taven said. What are friends for if they can't even listen to you whine from time to time? Besides, it was a fun evening. One moment of depressing seriousness isn't going to ruin it. Eventually they reached a crossroads where their paths separated and stopped. Zorian racked his head for a moment, trying to figure out what was the appropriate way to end the date. They weren't actually romantically involved, after all. So I guess this is it, he eventually said lamely. I guess it is, Taven agreed, equally lamely. After a second of hesitation, with neither of them making a move to leave, Taven spoke up again. Hey, she suddenly said. So, I know you said you were totally over me and I totally respect that. But just in case you ever change your mind about that, you should really work on your body a little. What? Zorian asked, surprised. You know. Start running and exercising. Pick up some kind of physically intensive outdoor hobby. Put on some muscle, she said. I'm not saying you stand no chance otherwise, but... Well. Taven's preferences in men aside, he had been rather annoyed with his lack of endurance lately. It made things more difficult than they needed to be and forced him to constantly drink potions just to keep up with Zack and others. It wasn't a huge issue in the time loop, but such an extensive use of potions was inadvisable in the long term. Once he was out of the time loop, he'd probably end up working on his physique on his own initiative, just so he could maintain the sort of pace he was used to by now. In any case, this was the end of their evening together. After saying their goodbyes, both of them went their separate ways. Zorian deliberately took the scenic route back to Amaya's place, consumed in his own thoughts and in no hurry to get back to sleep. Simulacrum number 2, stationed in Koth, was pretty pleased with how things were going. Being stationed in Koth was usually a rather boring task, since it meant being stranded in an alien land whose language and writing he did not understand. He couldn't read any of the local books, he couldn't engage in casual conversations with people, and he couldn't cast any spells without good reason. This time, however, he was living in the Terramachula estate. The Terramachula knew very well he was just a simulacrum, but this didn't seem to bother them much. They treated him just as well as they did the real Zorian. They gave him a room to sleep in, a teacher to help him master the local language, and access to things like paper and building materials for his research. Plus, there was Torin and Kerma, Damon's two teammates who were currently trapped in the Terramachula estate. Perhaps because they currently had nothing better to do and were bored out of their minds, or maybe because the original really left an impression on them, but both of them proved very receptive to the simulacrum's offer of magic exchange. Kerma was the more conventional of the two. Although Zorian had never seen divinations being used in such a way before he'd met her, she claimed she was using pretty standard magic that could be acquired from practically anywhere. Even her flower-shaped divination aid was simply something she had commissioned from a professional artificer, not something she had made herself. Thus, she didn't feel much need to keep her method secret. In exchange for the many rare and exotic spells that Zorian had acquired in the time loop, she was entirely willing to show him some tricks of her trade and give him guidance on how best to develop his divination skills. In addition, she gave him a list of people to talk to in case he wanted to pursue a career in the field, completely unprompted by the simulacrum. He suspected she had some kind of deal with these people to send young talents their way, but he decided to give them a visit in one of the future restarts anyway. As for Torin, he was pursuing a very rare and exotic field of magic that involved extracting and preserving organs of magical creatures and then using specialized control spells to turn them into something of an extension of the caster. It was not a popular field of study, both due to having been created relatively recently and because it existed in something of a legal limbo in most places, so Torin was actually ecstatic when the simulacrum showed an interest in it. Most people considered his magic to be somewhat creepy and off-putting. The simulacrum very much doubted the original would dive particularly deeply into the field. It would take a lot of time to get anywhere with it, and it didn't provide anything they desperately needed. However, some of the spells and techniques Torin used to control and make use of his eyes could potentially be used to improve coordination between Zorian and his golems, or even Zorian and his simulacrums. Of course, such developments were too general to be the cause of the simulacrum's current happiness with his situation. The truth was, he had recently dodged a huge bullet. Mother and father were coming to Koth, and someone had to pick them up and smuggle them into the Terramachula estate. That someone was, of course, Daimen, but Daimen also insisted that Zorian accompany him in this task. He wouldn't budge on this in the slightest, stubbornly insisting it was Zorian's family duty to accompany him to pick up their parents. Sometimes it was good to be just a simulacrum. While the original had to explain to mother and father what he was doing in Koth, he was told instead to stay hidden from them at all times in order to minimize the amount of necessary explanations. An order he was only too happy to obey. At some point Orissa had also entered the room, but he paid little heed to that, giving her a short greeting and then getting back to his book. He had monopolized one of the 3 tables in the room, stacking it full of books that he judged to be relatively easy to understand, but that still left plenty of space for her to work with. He didn't react even when she looked over his shoulder to see what he was reading. He wasn't ashamed of his choice of reading in the slightest. Everybody had to start somewhere. Plus, the book had pretty pictures. However, Orissa didn't just pick up a book from the library and leave, like the simulacrum expected her to. Instead, she fetched a chair from a nearby empty table and sat down next to him. "Yes?" he asked, curious. It was unusual for Orissa to deliberately seek him out like this, to say the least. Aside from that one time when she invited the original for a discussion via Daimen, she had been quite reserved. "I'm worried," she said simply. "Daimen and your other self should be back in a few hours." "Ah," the simulacrum said, suddenly understanding what this was about. "You're worried about mother and father coming here." "Yes," she confirmed. I know I'm being rude here, but I was wondering if you could tell me a little about your parents. Me? The simulacrum asked incredulously. I was told simulacrums retain most of the memory of the original, Orissa said blandly. You know that wasn't my point, the simulacrum complained. Orissa smiled faintly at him. I mean, the original doesn't exactly have the best relationship with the rest of his family. What could I possibly tell you that Daimen hadn't already? Daimen got really evasive about his parents once it became obvious they don't approve of our marriage, Orissa said, shaking her head. He says I shouldn't worry, that he'll handle it, but how can I possibly not worry? He clearly thinks the world of them, and here they are, coming all the way to another continent to talk him out of marrying me. This will probably sound a little flippant, but there's probably no need for you to worry so much over this, the simulacrum told her. He's their darling genius son. Whatever he wants, he's going to get it. It's been that way since forever. It would still mean a lot to me if you could tell me a little about them before they arrive, Orissa insisted. Simulacrum number 2 gave her a contemplative look. Truthfully, he wasn't sure if telling her about mother and father would be a good idea. His depiction of them would no doubt be really negative, and might end up worsening tensions between his parents and Orissa as a result. That probably wasn't in anyone's interest, least of all Orissa's. You're basically asking me to stick my hand into the fire, here, the simulacrum said. I guess I am, she admitted. Then let me ask you something first, the simulacrum said. Are you interested in Daimen only because of his mind magic bloodline thingy? He expected Orissa to be either shocked at the question or explode with outrage. He did not expect her to laugh at him. What, are you worried I'm taking advantage of your big brother? She asked with a grin. Just a little, the simulacrum admitted. He's an empath, so he should be hard to fool, but you're a talented mind mage from a family specializing in mind magic. Anything is possible. And here Daimen thinks you hate him, Orissa said with a sigh. To answer your question, it's definitely not irrelevant. I love him, but if he didn't have this innate mind magic affinity of his, I probably would not choose to marry him. I love my family too, and I need to keep their interests in mind. However, do you honestly think your brother is marrying me purely for love? The simulacrum gave her a surprised look. By marrying me, he is marrying into nobility and wealth. It's not his only concern, but it's hardly irrelevant. If I was a poor orphan, or even just a well-to-do middle-class girl, he would have never agreed to marry me. So no, I don't think I'm taking advantage of him. We both have our ambitions. It's just fortunate that we can fulfill them with someone we actually like. The simulacrum said thoughtfully. After a few seconds of silence, Orissa spoke up again. So can I get an answer to my question, then? She asked. Sure, the simulacrum shrugged. So, the first thing you should know about our parents is that they're very driven and ambitious people. Our father, Ander Kaczynski, was the 4th son of a wealthy farmer. Our mother, Sikin Kaczynski, was the only daughter of one of the few remaining witches, who raised her alone after her husband left her. Father knew that as a 4th son, he would never inherit anything. Thus, when he was 15 years old, he managed to procure a small loan from his father and left home to open his own business. He married our mother less than a year later. Over the years, they had turned that small initial business into a local power that has made them quite wealthy and respected. Well, not by your standards, but... It's impressive, Orissa nodded. They reached surprising heights from such humble roots. That must have taken a lot of work. They did work very hard to get where they are, the simulacrum agreed. He had his disagreements with mother and father, but they had very much earned their wealth and status. Of course, their success involved just as much scheming as it did hard work, but he was pretty sure Orissa understood that part without him having to spell it out. But while such attitude brought them success, it does have some consequences. Bluntly put, they view almost everything through the prism of how it will reflect on the family reputation and finances. This marriage between you and Daimen, even if mother and father thought this was a good thing for Daimen. That's it. That's what I've been missing all this time. They don't see the benefit for the family as a whole. Orisa exclaimed suddenly. Of course. After putting so much money and effort into Daimen, they naturally expect to see some kind of return for their trouble. We'll continue this later, okay? I need to make some arrangements. The simulacrum watched, surprised and amused, as Orisa hurriedly left the library. He wasn't entirely sure what happened there, but it would seem that Orisa didn't actually perceive his parents' attitude as wrong. Considering the sort of background she comes from and her explanation about how her marriage with Daimen came to be, he probably shouldn't be surprised. Well, at least now I know why Daimen likes her so much, Simulacrum mused quietly to himself. She's like a younger version of Mother. Sometimes life really is a comedy. Despite all these preparations, the whole plan would have surely failed if Daimen had really gone to pick up Mother and Father during this trip. In reality, the whole operation was simply a giant distraction. Its main purpose was to mask the fact that Zorian had created a third simulacrum while they were teleporting around randomly through Koth and then sent it away to hide while they drew everyone's attention. When Daimen and Zorian returned to the Terramachula estate, Zorian's brand new simulacrum slowly made his way to Jasuka and then opened a hidden gate between the city and the estate, allowing Daimen to enter and leave the city too quickly for anyone to really intercept him. Naturally, this meant that Zorian's involvement was absolutely crucial for the operation's success. If it weren't for that, Zorian would have never agreed to take part in it, no matter how much Daimen begged and threatened. How the hell was he supposed to explain his presence in Koth to Mother and Father? No matter how poor their knowledge of magic was, they would surely recognize dimensional gates and simulacrums as high-level magic that should be way beyond him. Even if you hadn't come with me, they would have still realized you were in Koth, Daimen told him. You are too well known among the Terramachula by now. Someone would have surely let them know about you, whether intentionally or accidentally. Maybe, but that wouldn't have been my problem, Zorian countered. I'd be back in Scioria, and it would be your job to figure out an explanation that made sense and deal with their attitude. Daimen scowled at him, saying nothing. In any case, the initial meeting was much calmer and more subdued than Zorian expected. The steamship that carried their parents languidly entered Jasuka harbor and then disgorged an endless stream of passengers and cargo, temporarily creating a miniature pandemonium as the throng of disembarking people and dockworkers shouted and pushed at one another. By the time Daimen and Zorian had found Mother and Father, they already looked absolutely exhausted and were in no mood to start a fight. They were surprised to see Zorian in Koth, of course, but mostly they were glad to have an extra person help out with the luggage and whatnot. Aren't you supposed to watch Kiriel? Mother asked him, frowning. I am, Zorian said. I'm just here to pick you up. I'll be back in Scioria before nightfall. How? Father asked. I thought no one could teleport over such distances. And teleportation is supposed to be advanced magic, anyway. It's a secret, Zorian simply said. Father made an indecipherable hum and said nothing further. Whatever it is, I hope you can use the same method to send us home when the time comes, Mother said, sounding worn and tired. Ship travel doesn't agree with me. I think I lost a whole year of my life getting here. It would be great if we could avoid boarding a ship for the return trip. And that was it. Nothing more was spoken about Zorian's presence. Especially since, when the group had finally stepped through the dimensional gate and entered the Terramachula estate, they were greeted by Orisa and the rest of the Terramachula delegation. At that point, the mystery of Zorian's presence on another continent was the furthest thing from their minds. Naturally, Mother and Father were full of smiles and compliments. The tiredness they displayed before Daimen and Zorian seemed to instantly disappear, and they busied themselves with handing out very expensive gifts and endlessly praising the thoughtfulness and generosity of their hosts. If Zorian hadn't known in advance what their purpose for coming here was, he would have never guessed they disapproved of the marriage. 2 days passed. Mother and father slowly settled into the Terramachula estate. Zorian tried to stay away from the place as much as possible, not wanting to get tangled into Damon's mess too much, and the simulacrum he had left in the estate did the same. As such, he didn't really know how their attempts to talk Daimon out of the marriage were progressing. He had his own things to worry about. Now that he had a simulacrum outside the Terramachula estate, he hurriedly arranged for a group of silent doorway adepts to be transported to Koth, next to one of the local Bakura gates. Happily, the operation to acquire the gate key was a full success. Both Zorian and the silent doorway adepts were ecstatic about this. For the Urania, this gate key represented access to a virgin territory awash with opportunities. For Zorian, it was a way to ensuring easy access to Koth without having to rely on Daimon. Plus, he suspected that having this key would make it much easier to convince the silent doorway adepts to cooperate with him in future restarts. Now, however, Zorian was back in the Terramachula estate. His parents had specifically called for him to come see them. In all honesty, Zorian had totally expected this to happen. They had taken his presence in Koth in stride when they had first come, but now that they had time to rest, talk with people and think about things, they no doubt realized there was something very much off about him. The only thing he hadn't been certain of was whether the restart would have come to an end before this happened. He was currently standing in one of Terramachula meeting rooms, father and mother standing in front of him. Originally, Daimon had wanted to be present for the talk as well, but they had shooed him away, insisting this was a private talk. That had been kind of amusing. It was not often that they treated their favorite son in such fashion. Apparently, whatever arrangements Orisa did were insufficient, and they still opposed the marriage. And since Daimon stubbornly refused to give up on the idea, they were currently not terribly fond of him. "We spoke with Daimon about you," Mother said suddenly. She had a complex, worried look on her face, as if she was having trouble deciding how to handle this. Father, on the other hand, stayed silent and stony-faced, his emotions indecipherable. "Yes." Zorian responded blandly. "He tells us you're incredibly powerful and competent. Far more than you let on," she said. "True," Zorian admitted. He didn't see the point of hiding it. They already knew he could move across continents in a quick, reliable manner. "But why would you keep something like that hidden from us?" Mother asked imploringly. "Having another genius in the family is a joyous thing. Surely you don't think we would have stood in your way?" "Ah, you mean like you're not standing in the way of Damon's marriage?" Zorian asked innocently. "That's something completely different," Mother said, scowling at him. She quickly reined herself in, however. "And besides, we're not standing in Damon's way. We're simply trying to pull him back for taking a wrong turn. If he stubbornly refuses to heed our advice, we will reluctantly accept it, not sabotage his life in revenge." "What she's saying," Father suddenly spoke up, "is that we already disagree with what you're doing with your life, so what's one disagreement more? You can just throw one of your juvenile hissy fits, just like you always do, and we'll grit our teeth and bear it because at the end of the day you're still our son. Just like we always do." Zorian stretched his mouth into a thin line and gave Father a narrowed stare, but said nothing. Father simply stared back at him, as if daring him to say anything. "Ander, honey, I thought we agreed I would be the one to talk," Mother sighed. Father raised both of his hands in a gesture of surrender. He also gave her an exasperated look, but she had already turned back toward Zorian, ignoring him. "What are you planning?" "Zorian?" Mother asked him bluntly. "Nothing much," Zorian said. "I'm going to move out of the house immediately after I graduate. Maybe sooner. Open my own business, buy myself a house, things like that." "You think running a business is easy?" Father challenged. "Well, that didn't take long. I'm an amazing mage," Zorian said immodestly. "Even if I had the worst business sense in the world, I'd still be able to make enough for a living." "But the family business," Mother began. Not for all the money in the world, Zorian said, cutting her off. A brief silence descended upon the scene as mother and father shared a long look between them. Oh. Zorian said, suddenly remembering something. I'll also take care of Kiriel. This statement naturally caused both of them to give Zorian a look of surprise. What do you mean you'll take care of Kiriel? Mother asked slowly. Why would she need someone to take care of her? Well, someone needs to teach her magic and nullify that stupid arranged marriage you prepared for her, Zorian said casually. A look of intense, shocked outrage appeared on Mother's face. For a moment she seemed unable to process what she just heard, but then she outright exploded at him. You little brat, she snapped at him agitatedly. You have no idea what you're talking about. Weirdly, Father just laughed at the scene, shaking his head at nobody in particular. Zorian was mystified by this reaction, but decided to ignore it for now. The situation seems simple enough to my eyes, Zorian countered, unperturbed by her outrage. In regards to living your life, we can humor you, but you have no right at all to tell me how to raise my daughter. Mother shouted angrily at him, stomping threateningly straight into his personal space. You are way out of line. Ender, you tell him. What, me? Father said with a look of exaggerated surprise. I thought we agreed you would be the one to talk to him. Mother gave him an angry, venomous look that promised later retribution, but didn't press him further. You have no idea what's in Kiriel's best interest, Zorian, Mother told him warningly. Don't stick your nose where it does not belong. I'm afraid that, if I don't get an actual explanation, I'm still going to go through with my idea, Zorian told her. You can't take a child from her parents, even if you're her brother, Mother told him angrily. We can call the police. But would you actually do so? Zorian challenged. She shrank back a little. They both knew she wouldn't. Besides, I bet that marriage is of questionable legality to begin with. Why? Zorian frowned. I'm trying to do her a favor. Mother shouted, turning to face his again. Don't you know what her roots are? What my mother was? Zorian gave her an uncomprehending look. Her mother? What did her mother have to do with anything? He knew they didn't get along well, but he never really heard anything too shocking about her. Besides, she had been dead for a while now. Wait, he said. Are you talking about? She was a witch. Mother said, preempting his conclusion. She was a witch and she was so damned proud of that fact. She never let anyone forget it. Once, she even threatened she was going to poison the town well when a bunch of customers tried to get out of paying her for the potions she made them. You know, just like the witches of old were said to do when someone wronged them. Zorian winced. You have no idea what it's like to be the daughter of a witch, Mother continued. A son is fine. Witches didn't care about male children. Everyone knows this. They firmly believed that magic was transferred to the child through the womb, so only a daughter can continue the lineage. Zorian raised an eyebrow at her. Why would they? I don't know why they believed what they did. Mother said, as if reading his mind. I never cared to know. I just wished she would shut up about witches and let me live some semblance of a normal life. But she never did, so everyone around me saw me as a soul-stealing, mind-ensnaring, poison-wielding witch-in-waiting. And if Kiriel learns magic, she'll suffer the same fate. Mother, Zorian sighed. I was really lucky to marry your father, Mother said. Well, you were a pretty fine catch yourself, Father said, grinning. He had been silent while Mother ranted about her childhood frustrations, but apparently he now felt it was safe to throw in a comment or two. Mother ignored him, though. She was probably still angry about his earlier quip about her being the designated speaker. My daughter won't have to fear for her future and rely on luck to find a good husband. She won't have people cross to the other side of the road when they see her or spreading vile slander about her completely unprovoked, Mother continued. Unlike my mother, I've done everything I can to distance myself from our family legacy. So long as she takes my example and stays well away from anything magic-related, anyone that tries to start something will end up looking petty and paranoid. But if she starts learning magic, then everything will be ruined. You don't know that, Zorian pointed out. Why take the risk? Mother challenged. Maybe if she married early, to a wealthy and respected husband, but you already said you are opposed to that, didn't you? So where does that leave us? Zorian stared at her. This was the side of Mother that he had never really known before. Was this why she was so obsessed with family reputation and social position? He looked at Father, but the man was uncharacteristically skittish. He just looked away, refusing to meet his eyes. Though he didn't actually say anything, Zorian understood the message. He was on his own here. Kyriel was Mother's project, and he wasn't going to stick his nose in it unless he had to. What if Kyriel doesn't want to go along with your plan? Zorian asked slowly. She's 9, Mother said. She doesn't know what she wants. She's not always going to be 9, though, Zorian pointed out. Yes, well, we can continue this conversation when she gets older, she told him firmly. You didn't start learning magic when you were 9 either. She had a point there. In all honesty, he wasn't willing to push this matter further than this. He mostly just raised the issue to gauge her reaction to it. He hadn't expected this sort of response. On top of that, while Kyriel said she wanted to learn magic, she was also rather impatient and flighty. Who knew whether she was even capable of the discipline required to become a mage? Besides, the most important thing was that the arranged marriage was apparently just an informal thing and not something his parents would push for at all costs. He couldn't claim with certainty that it would be a good idea to teach Kyriel magic, but he knew for a fact that she hated the arranged marriage thing. Right, Zorian said finally. I'm not informed enough to make a decision here, so I'll withdraw for now. You're damn right you're going to withdraw, she told him. She still sounded outraged, but the anger was visibly draining out of her now that he was no longer challenging her. What the hell made you think you have the right to give me parenting advice? Not even your father dares to tell me how to raise my daughter, and you, an immature brat that has never even been with a woman, think you can tell me what to do. Why don't you make a daughter of your own if you think? This was going to take quite a while, wasn't it? Out of the corner of his eye he saw Father staring at the scene and smiling faintly in schadenfreude. Zorian sighed. Yes, this would definitely take a while. So, I discovered a new function of the orb, Zack said. Zorian stopped working on the metal, flower-shaped construct on his bench and gave Zack a curious look. What do you mean you found a new function? Zorian asked. I mean, one completely unrelated to its role as a mobile palace, Zack said, waving the orb in front of him. Look. Take the orb and try this. It took a while for Zack to convey to Zorian what he had to do to activate this new function he discovered. After all, the way Zorian interacted with the orb was completely different from the way Zack did. Zack's way was more instinctive, almost automatic, whereas Zorian had to take the initiative and actively grope around for a way to interface with it. Eventually, though, he succeeded. He connected with the orb in the new manner that Zack found and immediately found himself connected to something. Some kind of empty space, maybe. Weird, Zorian eventually said. Yeah, Zack said. I have no idea what this does, though. Neither do I, said Zorian after some tinkering. He handed the orb back to Zack. Keep tinkering with it. You'll probably have more luck with it than I would. Besides, Zack had far more free time to tinker with the orb than Zorian did. The restart was nearing its end and there were so many things that needed to be done. The restart was almost over. Overall, Zorian would have described it as a highly productive one. The study of the gate stabilization frame they had stolen from the Abasin base yielded a lot more results than Zorian expected. He now knew that some very unconventional methods had been used while making the gate. Instead of carving the spell formula necessary for the operation of the frame, the Abasins had embedded them directly into the frame in the form of numerous magic threads. The frame literally had to be peeled away, layer by layer, in order for researchers to record the layout of the threads and attempt to decipher it. Sadly, though they had invited many capable researchers on the project, they had failed to make sense of how the frame worked. Perhaps if the gate frame was still actively maintaining a dimensional passage, but as it was? Not a chance. Still, it was a start. A lot of important groundwork had been done, and future analysis of the gate should go much faster. It was probably good that they didn't manage to take an active gate in this restart. If they did, they would no doubt shy away from simply taking it apart like they ended up doing here, and several crucial insights would never have been made. The interrogation of Sudomir was also a success. Granted, the man knew so many important things that he and Alanik had already agreed to keep kidnapping him in future restarts as well, but even his current gains were considerable. For instance, Zorian had finally found out what the deal was behind his strange transformations. While Sudomir was an extremely talented warder and soul mage, and dabbled in lots of other magics as well, he was not terribly impressive as a fighter. Sudomir was well aware of this, and thus decided to close that vulnerability by becoming a shifter. But he was overconfident and reached far beyond his grasp. Rather than picking one specific magical creature to fuse his soul with, he decided to splice up several magical creatures into some kind of unholy abomination that theoretically combined the best features of all of them and then fused with that. According to Alanik, it was incredible that the ritual didn't end up turning him utterly insane or a quivering mass of unstable flesh right from the get-go. As it was, the shifter ritual he designed was only a partial failure. The transformation was almost uncontrollable, forcing him to keep it suppressed at all times. But whenever he was under a lot of stress or in emotionally charged situations, his control inevitably started to slip, warping his mind. Still, while the shifter ritual was a failure in many ways, it did give him his signature resilience. One of the creatures he used in crafting his initial abomination was a troll, and the other a dragon. The other three were similarly hard to kill. Zorian shuddered to think what would happen if he were allowed to completely transform into his composite form. Another thing they found out from Sudomir was that there were some people related to the cult of the World Dragon that they had missed thus far when investigating the invaders. This was because they technically weren't cultists. In fact, they were purposely kept separated from known cultists as much as possible, so they would look as clean as possible in case somebody investigated them. This included a fair number of lawyers, low-level politicians and even a respected judge. There was no time left to really check these people out, and Zorian suspected they weren't too important for understanding the invasion, but he made a mental note to investigate them anyway. Just for the sake of being thorough. Eventually the day of the summer festival came and no attack occurred. The Abasins continued evacuating, the cult of the World Dragon never made a move, and the primordial trapped in the hole was never released. But the restart ended right on schedule anyway, and Zorian woke up in Siren, with Kiriel wishing him a good morning.